The wind came in off the sea, cold and raw. A skinning knife drawn along the bones of the faithful gathered upon the black rocks. Waves worked the foot of the cliffs of Old Wick with the steady patience of a butcher's hands, and the gulls rode the swells without complaint, heads flat to the wind, their pale eyes shut against spray. Men had raised a timber dais upon the weeping stone, and crowned it with a throne of driftwood and nail-salted planks, and upon that seat the priests had laid a ragged net of weed and shell. The old god of the deeps had no eyes carved and set to watch them. He had the endless waters and the gray sky and the cold breath that called to drowning. It was enough. Euron Damfair's hair was the color of iron left too long in brine, tied back in a rope that dripped upon his shoulders as he lifted his hands to quiet the crowd. The men answered him with the chant that they had learned in their mother's milk, rising and falling like oars. What is dead may never die, but rises again, harder and stronger. Some said it as a comfort. Euron spoke it as a promise, a binding. The god's voice was in the rush of the breakers, and it had told him to bring them here, to test them in the salt and the wind, to name their king beneath a sky bare of soft mainland gods. He had summoned them for a holy choosing. They came out of long ships and dories, out of halls on cliff and knoll, carrying wet shields and helms feathered with spray, lordlings and salt sons and men who owned nothing but a knife, all of them hungry for what the world had not given them, and would never give them if they were patient. Victarion stout stubby, Victarion of the Iron Victory, Victarion brother to Euron and Aeron, stood like a pillar of iron by the dais, square-shouldered, silent as a moored ship, the copper rings of his beard clotted with salt. Near him, Asha moved like a line in a storm, quick and sure-footed, a crow's wing of dark hair half loosed in the wind, her grin knife bright as she set her boot upon an overturned cask and laughed low to a man who jostled her. Theon was not there. Theon was a prayer unanswered, and a sin unconfessed, and a ghost for which Euron had no right. The one who came last wore a smile like a torn sail, and a cloak blacker than the crack between two waves at night. None heard his steps over the surf, yet the men around him backed before they saw him, and a hush moved where he moved. Euron Crow's eye. He stood at the base of the dais and set his hand upon the timber, and a gull landed upon the old king's chair and cried once, thin and mournful, before lifting again into the gray. He was not tall as Victarion nor broad, and yet he seemed taller and broader than any man there because he looked upon them all with a single blue eye alight like an oil lamp, and another patched in black, as if night itself had chosen him as its emissary. He had rings upon his fingers and a small bird-bone boy behind him, bearing a length of something wrapped in oiled cloth. "I have sailed farther than this wind," Euron said when Euron allowed it, when the tide of voices dropped. "I have drunk shade that tasted of the end of maps. I have climbed a tower of skulls, and whispered into a candle that had not burned in 1,000 years. I heard song in the language of the fire, and I brought a gift." His smile, then, had no mirth in it. He gestured, and the boy with the parcel came forward, barefoot, eyes cast down. They unwrapped it upon the wet boards, a horn long as a man's arm and more, ridged in dark bands that caught what little light there was and held it like tar. The runes on it were not iron-born scratching. They were steel blue letters whose edges had tasted a forge no man there had seen, running like fish down the length of the horn. The mouth was rimmed with red gold, the belly wound with black vein lines, like those in the rocks of the smoking sea. The breath around it shifted, the gulls rose and wheeled once, and the waves struck the cliff with a sound like a drum. Euron's tongue tasted ash beneath the salt. "It is cursed," he said softly, but the wind took the words and the men heard what they wished. Euron's smile widened. "It is named," he said, fingers brushing the runes as if they might burn him, and as if he desired to be burned. "Its name is a lie and a prayer, both, as all names are. It says it will kill any man who blows it. Perhaps it lies, perhaps it does not. The god will know. I bring it to bind what has never been bound by us. I bring it to yoke fire to salt." Victarion's mouth was hard as a hook. "Whose horn is it, brother?" "Mine," Euron said, and the blue of his living eye looked out beyond Old Wick across leagues of sea, not at Victarion but through him. "And yours, if you do what is needed with it." For I am lord of the isles only until I am king of more than the isles, and ships and men break against walls unless they have flame to soften stone. This is such flame. He made a motion, and the boy with the raw knees and the bitten nails took the horn up and carried it to the edge of the dais. Euron's other men pressed forward, and Euron selected one with a single glance, a thrall whose back had a map of lash scars, and whose hair was the color of parchment that had soaked in tea. The thrall's eyes were far away, as if the wind had taken his wits. He was given the horn. Euron would have spoken. He would have cried warning and cast the thing into the sea, for he felt the sea recoil from it, as a man draws back from a cold iron brand in winter. But the god of the deeps did not speak to him in that moment. The god turned its face away, as if to watch some whale breach far from shore, as if to say, "This is man's folly, not mine." The thrall lifted the horn. He set the red gold rim to his cracked lips. For one beat of time, nothing happened save the sliding of ropey kelp upon the rocks below, and the ache of wind in old bones. Then the horn sounded. The sound was not sound alone. The air thickened, as if a net had been thrown over it, and pulled tight. What came out of the horn was a note too low for ears that had not listened to depths. It came as a pressure at the eyes and a pain in the teeth. It stroked the inside of men's skulls with a finger wet and cold and knowing. Women would have bled if women had been there. The gulls did not scream. They dropped like stones to the sea and lay upon it as a fleet of feathers. The waves paused at the rock as if a hand was laid upon them and bade them wait. The thrall's skin darkened, as if something below it were heating him from the mouth outward. The flesh at his lips charred in a tidy circle. Smoke rose from his nostrils, thin as sewing thread. He did not stop the sounding. The sound went on, the note changing shape, going sharper, turning upon itself like a hooked fish, digging backward. Men knelt. Men who had never knelt clutched their bellies and put their faces to the wet board. Euron saw it. The world made thinner for a heartbeat. The veil across all things drawn aside by a wind that did not blow. He saw 3 vast shadows thrown upon a sky far across the world. He saw heat move like a living thing under scales. Felt old stone in some eastern city remember screaming. He saw a girl with silver hair stop in a doorway and look up. The pupils of her eyes like drops of oil in milk. Her breath caught. He saw chains and flame and bronze doors yawning. And he saw his brother Euron's smile widen very slightly, so little that no one else would have noticed it, as if the piece he had placed upon this board had slid into a groove he had measured beforehand. The sound ended. The thrall dropped to his knees with a clatter that was too small for the work done. He fell forward. The char at his lips had the crispness of a pie crust. His eyes were 2 small mirrors that reflected only the gray of the sky. The horn lay beside him, warm enough that the air around it warped and shimmered, like heat above a brazier. The runes along its flank were dull again. Euron stood, and the wind returned to itself, and the gulls shuddered and lifted one by one from the water, as if they had agreed among themselves that they would live. "What is dead may never die," Euron said as easily as a man calls for ale. "We saw no flames here, but I tell you a great fire has just been given the name of iron. You cannot see the rope when you cast it, not while it flies, but the knot will find purchase if you know your art. Who will have me for king?" Then Ancho. It was not then that they lifted him. Ironborn were not so far gone as to be charmed by the first trick a black-eyed shark chose to show. They roared and they shouted the names they had brought with them to shout. They raised Asha. They lifted Victarion's name to taste how it felt in their mouths. They pounded their spear butts and slapped their shields, and the priests sang and Euron prayed. But in the night that followed, when fires were banked low and the tide went out far and whispering, men woke from dreams smelling smoke that had never touched these shores and heard, confused in their ears, the echo of a horn. Some of them thought of dragons. Some of them did not think at all, but their hands opened and closed uselessly as if tightened by work that had occurred elsewhere. And when the gray dawn came up as aimless as spilled milk, they were tired in ways that had nothing to do with sleep. The sea does not change simply because men believe it should, but it does respect a man who goes out into it as far as he can, and Euron Crow's eye had gone so far that the sea could no longer pretend he had not. 2 days after the horn, 3 longships came splashing through outer swells with sails showing a stain of pitch like a black hand, and upon their decks were curiosities from bright, wrong-smelling harbors. Thin boys with eyes the color of bruises, jars sealed with wax and bitumen, bales wrapped in silk that wetted and darkened with salt, priests with shaved scalps and rings burned into their flesh. Euron smiled upon them as if they were cousins home from a war. Victarion looked upon them as upon nets, full of something that moved strangely under murk. Victarion stood upon the deck of the Iron Victory that evening, with the tide throwing itself white against the ribs of the isle, the cables humming against the pull of the anchor in the way a bowstring hums in winter. The horn lay upon a table built of ship planks nailed over a barrel, and the dusky woman sat beside it. He did not call her by any other name. She wore bracelets of jet and had a scar across her throat that was delicate and careful, as if it had been made by a patient man with time to worry it. Her eyes were not empty. Victarians were not clever enough to name what filled them. "The Red Priest says the horn will obey the man who owns it," Victarion said. The words were heavy as a bolt head. He did not look at the woman, only at the black-blue runes that seemed to move when he did not focus upon them. But who owns it? The man who paid for it? The man who found it? The man whose blood it drinks? The dusky woman touched the horn with 2 fingers. Her nails were clean and well-shaped. She traced one line of rune, then another, as a mother might draw idle little paths upon the skin of an infant to calm herself, while she thought of other things. Her voice had been stolen by the scar. Her breath made the ghosts of words that had no sound. Mokoro came up from the belly of the ship, as if he had always been standing in the companionway, and the wood of it had decided to reveal him. He was big and soft-looking as a man of his size often is when his strength does not come from oars, with hair and beard like ridged iron pulled from a forge, both bound with copper. His eyes were kinder than Victarion liked, and they glittered with something not a man's. He smelled faintly of something sweet and spiced that had come from a town where the houses were the color of the clay of their making, and the smoke was white. "It is the owner who does not blow that the horn recognizes," Mokoro said, looking at Victarion's hand upon the table. "The runes say as much if you know their alphabets. The sounder will live long enough to teach the horn the shape of his master's name. Then he will die. The horn wants blood. The horn is an oath. A great many oaths are fuel. My God understands fuel. My God understands fuel." His smile was soft. "You ask whom the horn belongs to. It belongs to the man it obeys. Bender. And it will obey Euron if I use it," Victarion said. It was not a question. The priest did not answer. The dusky woman's eyes moved, and the bracelets on her wrist clicked once in a wind that had not stirred. Victarion had loved Euron once, as boys do when the world is small and the hearth is big. He remembered the warmth of the hall at the pike, when the wind howled and the rain came sideways, the smell of salt-boiled meat and wood smoke, the way stories grew in corners the longer you looked at them. He remembered Euron teaching him to hold his breath under the water until his chest fought him, to come up laughing, the 2 of them hair-slicked and bright-eyed. He remembered Euron taking a trinket from a Lysine trader and putting it into Victarion's hand as if he were king of all things. "Wear this when you go to meet girls, and they will think you are mysterious." He remembered waking as a man to the scorn and cold of that same brother, and hating him with a love that had rotted. The sea never forgets what you put into it. It brings back bodies unlooked for, coins lost, grudges. Victarion put both hands upon the table and felt tar and salt against his palm. "The god drowned me," he said. "I woke harder. I have won battles. He made me his storm. Perhaps the horn will learn my name." The words tasted like rusting copper in his mouth. He had not meant to say them aloud. Mokoro's eyes were patient. "Names," he said. "Names are the little hooks we hang our souls upon. They have a weight. But this horn was cast in a heat that does not respect little hooks." He reached out and did not touch the horn. "Still, you may try. The east has many doors. One of them will be the right one when the house you seek is as large as yours." "Then shall. What house do I seek?" Victarion asked before he could stop himself. Fire, Mokoro said, and smiled a smile that was not kindly at all. Fire and a woman, and the old order of stones broken so light can pass between them. But your brother seeks that same house by a different door. That is why the wind smells like a forge when you lift the horn's cloth. There are two men before the same threshold, both of them carrying salt on their boots and a different god behind their eyes. Then now, Victarion did not like to be compared to Euron, and he did not like riddles. He lifted the horn by the middle and felt the weight of it, like a small child asleep and too heavy. Bring a sounder, he said to the dusky woman. She stood without the little sigh or grumble a wife would have made. She moved as if she were a ship in a narrow channel, each step measured, the distance chosen for the next 3 steps already. When the thrall came, he had a face like a gull colored in with a dull lead pencil. He had a tattoo of a salt wife's head on his left wrist, such as men got in happy foolish youth when happiness seemed a thing one might brand into one's skin and never lose. He did not look at Victarion or at the priest. He looked at the sea that wrote itself in strips beyond the bay. Victarion handed him the horn and did not let his own finger brush the thrall's. The horn was warm. Victarion stepped back. On my word, he said. Not before. He did not know why he wanted to command it, but he did. It made him feel that he had a little rope around something that would not be roped. They went to sea within the day. There are journeys that feel like places in themselves, and the voyage to Slaver's Bay was one of those. The weather was not a single thing but a choosing. The sky trying to decide between 3 kinds of gray. The swells thick-shouldered and regular until a current crossed them and made a skin of wrinkles upon the sea's face. The Iron Victory led, slew across the water with the confidence of a blade that knows its wielder's wrist. Behind her came Silence with its stripped decks, and its mute crew with black tongues and blank faces that looked at nothing. No drum beat upon Silence. Its oars moved like a centipede's legs without sound. Euron stood in its stern, wrapped in a long coat that looked dry though spray kissed it and loved it. His one blue eye watched the horizon. The patch watched the god. The fleet gathered unto itself things it passed. A galley with a broken mast limped out from among the rocks and fell into their train like a dog beneath a long wagon. A Drummond whose captain had just then decided to change gods and run west, found he had, and a cutter whose crew had intended to run to Norvos for a cargo of wine discovered the wind was different today, and that ironborn songs were easier to sing than merchant's caution. Euron did not raise a hand to gather them. He watched and smiled slightly, and they came. Victarion practiced the horn in the nights when the moon was a dirty sliver and the water was black as oil. He did not lift the horn to his own mouth. He did not trust that the horn would not remember an owner out of a careless kiss. He made the thralls sound it. He made them drink a cup of Victarion's blood before they blew, and he spoke the god's words over the cup, his voice low and grave, so the god would be a knot in the horn's court of oaths. He thought this would matter. He did not tell Mokoro what he had done. Mokoro knew without being told. Sometimes, when the horn went up and its sound came down, flying outward like the wings of a dark bird, Victarion felt a pull inside him, as if his ribs were the bars of a cage being pried. The sound was always different. Once it was like the breath of a mountain. Once it was like the crying of a woman heard from the bottom of a well. Once it was nothing, a moment of emptiness so complete it made Victarion's knees unlock with the sudden need to sit down and catch himself upon the deck. The sounders died. He had expected it. He did not think about it. He made more sounders. Euron gave him more. In the morning, gulls followed the ships and screamed and fell silent when the horn sounded. In the middle nights, a child was born upon a Drummond aft of the mizzenmast and lived. Men argued below decks and came up laughing. The ropes sang in their little ways, and the wind grieved or did not grieve. Euron knelt each dawn and put his face into a bucket of sea that was new enough to sting. He prayed until his fingers went numb and his lungs burned. He prayed for the god to take the horn into the deeps and lay it next to the bones of serpents. And if the god would not do that, then to give Euron a vision he could carry to his brothers like a knife. The god gave him a dream of a whale belly lit faintly by some phosphor and a shadow moving in that light with wings the length of the boat he slept in. He woke with his hair stiff with salt, and his mouth full of an old taste, like coins. The world outgrew gray by degrees as they made east. The light changed the way men changed with drink, losing reserve and finding an enthusiasm that could be ugly or beautiful, depending on your temper. The water took to being blue even when the sky refused. Flying fish burst from the face of it and went a long way, as if they were brief. Gleeful birds. Spices came on the wind invisibly, a breath of pepper, and something sweet, like the hour before bread is done baking. Far-off storms made bruises of purple in the sky and showed their blood vessels with long white veins of lightning, but they did not move to block the Ironborn. Euron's smile at such times altered, a little, as if a rival had chosen to step aside to let him through. Victarion did not trust weather that was too accommodating. He told the men to lash the cargo thrice to make up for a time when the sea would remember suddenness. Slaver's Bay took them as if it had been waiting with hands behind its back. They came upon it in the low gold of late day, its ring of cities distant as little buttons, but already showing colors brighter and more immodest than anything the Iron Islands tolerated. Meereen's pyramid rose out of green like a tooth in a jaw. It had a cap of something that turned the light about as a jewel does, and for a moment, Victarion saw it not as a place, but as a signal thrown to someone atop the world. Smoke lay over the city in slats. The river that fed it into the sea went out in threads, and streaked the water with a dirtier brown. To the south, the low backs of other pyramids made a row like old men on a bench with gold hats. Ships crawled, or lay like beetles upon the harbor and the roads. There was a smell, a complicated smell, of fruit that had started to rot, of perfume hiding sweat, of old blood on stone floors, near drains, of oil heating in pans, of horse. Victarion thought suddenly of the halls at Pike and their honest stink of fish scales and smoke and mold, and he hated this city for the mere fact that it had different stenches. He had expected to feel smaller. He did not. He felt like a hammer that had found an anvil. They did not go silent. The Ironborn. They announced themselves with what they were. Their bows, their sails, the very way their ships sat in the water. Slavers on the outer roadsteads shaded their eyes and told boys to run with messages and tried to decide whether to run into the harbor or out along the coast where they could not be seen. Within the hour, there were signals going up on the walls like startled birds, and a boy fell into the river from a bridge and came up laughing because he had not meant to fall and had discovered he loved it. Victarion ordered his ships in a crescent far enough off that catapults on the wall could not find them. Euron's silence took the center like an eye. They waited for the dark. There is a quiet that cities know in the small hours, when the night has had time to forget what the day was, and the day is far enough away to have no influence. Meereen had not known such a quiet for many months. War makes its own music. But that night a lull came, thin as a hand laid upon a fevered brow, and the drum of the city went softer. Victarion stood on his deck with bare feet and felt the shape of the planks under his skin as a blind man reads. He lifted a hand, and the sounder in that night came forward. He had a scar at his mouth, as if a friend had once tried to stop him from saying something at the wrong time by putting a knife there. He held the horn as a bridegroom holds a sword he has been given by his new father. "Not before my word," Victarion said, because he loved command as other men love wine. The sounder nodded. Euron's patch gleamed, and the jewel in his good eye was only a reflection of some lantern behind him. Victarion looked to the dusky woman. Her eyes were upon him. He looked to Mokoro. The red priest's lips moved, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in the shape of some lesson he wished the knight to learn. Victarion pricked his thumb and squeezed a bead of blood onto the horn's rim. He spoke the drowned words. The drop spread, dark, sticky, innocent of the sizes of gods. "Now," he said. The horn went to the sounder's mouth. It made its old, wrong music. Meereen woke, as if a hand had closed over its nose. Dogs barked and then forgot how. Somewhere a woman who had fallen asleep at last after a day of quick fear and quicker bargaining sat bolt upright and put her hand out to find a child who was not there. On the green slope of the pyramid a shadow loosed itself from iron bars and moved. In a cellar, there were chains that remembered being cooled in water after being taken from the smith. They lifted in the presence of heat that did not come from a forge. A boy in a tunic of linen too fine for him, employed to sweep a certain road, where a certain man walked, so his sandals would not be dirtied, dropped his broom and pressed his hands to his ears and cried without knowing why he cried. Victarion felt the note go through him like a spear made of soft wood that still pierced. He saw in his mind not images like those the priests talked about when they wanted to impress a king, not symbols. He saw two creatures that did not know symbols. They were not kings. They were not gods. They were bodies whose bones had grown large enough to cast their own climates. They had been put in chains and had not liked it. They were young enough in their largeness to find delight in heat for its own sake. They lifted their heads in a darkness lit faintly by lamps, and remembered something older than chains and hotter than dark. Their eyes did not humanize. They were what they were. Fire has its own patience. It had been lying quietly in the belly of the one that was the color of summer leaves, waiting, because fire is as obedient as a dog in the right hands, and as disobedient as a god in wrong ones. It uncurled. The other, pale as old parchment and bright as coin when there was light, tasted the air through the gate with a tongue as quick as thought. They answered the horn because the horn spoke to the part of them that had learned in some old time that there are sounds you follow to warm. The sounder's lips charred. He did not stop. The sound went on. It changed. Victarion had learned to hear changes. What had been a call was now a command shaped as a plea. The command had the weight of a name in it. A master's name. A name the horn had learned and filed away like a knife. Victarion felt rage rise in him like a storm tide, not because the dragons were answering, but because he could hear in the sound another man's claim. He had hoped the blood would teach it otherwise. It had not. He was not surprised. He was not a man surprised by many things. He lifted his head and looked at Euron and found his brother's smile waiting for his eyes like a cup on a table, set for one. Somewhere in the city, the bronze doors opened with a cry like a cut thing. The iron bars lifted, and the chains went slack, as if relieved of an opinion. The green one put his head through, and then his body, which was too big already for the space, and there was a sound of iron going aside and stone disliking it. The pale one wriggled, and did not wriggle, and was through. And the men set to minding them did not mind them any longer, because their legs had learned to run without waiting for owners. The dragons came up into a night that had forgotten that lights were only men's candles, and not stars fallen into bowls. They did not fly to the horn as a child runs to a bell. They did not fall out of the sky into Victarion's hands like minted coins. They flamed the air because the air deserved it. They rose not like birds, who must run and flap, and make a scene of effort, but like lords whose stairs are made to their stride. Their bellies showed a flicker of sun, as if someday were trapped under their scales. The green one's wings had a ragged place from some old fight. The pale one's nostrils were black from soot that never quite left. When they turned, the harbor shifted hues, from dark to darker, then to a brown made orange, then to a gold that should not have been and was. The Ironborn lifted their faces and opened their mouths like fish to take in the heat. Victarion reached out with his will, with his anger, with his memory of all the oars he had led and all the men he had put to it. He gave a shape to his desire. Not the city, yet not the body of the girl with silver hair whose name he did not speak on his deck. Not conquest, but a small thing. He pictured the nearest Yunkish galley that lay fat and sure with its stern to them. He pictured its sail, its ropes, its slick and oiled wood. He pictured it on fire. He put this picture into the horn's sound with a will as clear as the one with which he had once cut the tongue from a liar. He did not know if this was the grammar of it, the syntax by which one issued an order to a thing that had never marched in a line. He tried anyway. The green one turned its head first. It did not look at Victarion. Dragons do not check with men. But it tacked upon the air, a slight movement of wings that made a sound like a warhorse stamping, and dropped its body toward the line of galleys. It opened its mouth and gave them a lesson in why men had taught themselves to believe in gods. The flame went out from it in a blade, and then a sheet, white at the heart, yellow where it licked wood. The galley took flame the way dry grass takes wind-blown sparks. with a sudden joy as if it had always wanted to burn and had merely been too well behaved to admit it. Men shouted. Some jumped into the sea, which forgave them because it is magnanimous with small fry. Some tried to cut lines with knives that had been bought for display. The pale dragon came swooping a half-breath behind its brother with a curiosity that made it throw off a smaller gout of flame, not at a galley, but at the space between two. The fire learned to stand upon the water for a moment, and then lay down and drift in a slick. Euron's smile was not wide, but it grew very slightly, like a cutter stealing into a harbor without paying port fees. He did not lift his hands. His crew did not speak. Silence moved with the heavy grace of a thing that has learned to float in waters thicker than these. Victarion felt his heart beating in his throat. He wanted to shout. He wanted to exult. He wanted to take a bar of iron and batter his brother's smile out of the world with it. He kept his face like the face of the figurehead at the prow of the Iron Victory, calm and unblinking as all hells broke loose before him. Meereen woke fully now. There were bells there, somewhere, and drums in another quarter, and men who had thought themselves very brave ran bravely in the wrong directions, and then bravely found good sense. Torches moved like lines of ants. The dragons did not care about torches. They lifted and came around and made another pass with the confidence of men who have discovered they can do a trick and wish to show it twice. The Yunkish galleys gaped like fish in a net. The galley first hit, vomited smoke, and a single mast went by the board slowly, as if reluctant to let the ship know it was dying. Again, Victarion said, and did not know to whom he spoke. The sounder was upon his knees, smoke shaking from his mouth in a thin stream, and the horn lay against his teeth, and the circle at his lips was as neat as a brand made with a jeweler's tool. Again, Victarion said, and the horn spoke on even though the man who blew it was dead now. His body had not yet finished the work of acknowledging that truth, but the horn needed only a moment, and a name, and it had both. The sound went into the night like a nail driven into a board. The dragons climbed. They did not like instructions as such, but they did like repetition. They flamed once more, and then they played. They found that bodies in the water move differently when you set the water alight above them. They found that ships crack and show their ribs, and that ribs caught are good places to put fire, so it climbs. They were children very large and very dangerous, and the horn spoke to their hunger the way a mother's call speaks to a child who has just discovered it can climb a stair. It pulled at them. It did not tell them where their home was. It told them they had one. Euron Damfair saw it all from the deck of a little boat beside the Iron Victory, because the god had put him there as a cruel kindness. He felt an old grief in his chest and knew it was not grief at all but envy. Men clapped him upon the back after the first ship burned. "The god has given us wind and wings," they cried. And Euron let them say it, and he did not correct them, because the god had not given them wings, a horn had, and Euron had not learned a prayer to the horn. He longed for a wave big enough to swallow both dragons and his brother. He got a small chop that made the deck shift under his knees, and forced him to grab a rope like any other man. The god had a sense of humor like that. Euron tasted again the cold coins, and knew then what the horn really was. A purse full of stolen names. Who had taught it those letters? Who had laid his lips upon it first, while some old volcano watched? Men had, not gods. Men who thought themselves their own gods. Euron's hair dripped. He began to pray, because that is what is left to a priest when the world chooses an unblessed miracle. Before dawn the bay smoked. The sky above the city had learned to glow where it had not been meant to. Tower windows showed a trembling gold, as if the rooms behind them had lit themselves with a new sun. There were bodies in the water, and parts of bodies, and parts of ships, and ash delicate as old ladies' powder that set on a man's skin and made him look much older. The dragons had found that they did not need to trust men to find pleasure. They had played with masts, and with stacked amphorae on a quay, and with a stone statue of a man whose beard had once been feared, which they knocked from its plinth, and laughed at without laughter. At last, after more hours than Victarion had meant to call for, the horn's voice died the way a bell stops ringing in a church in a town that has burned long enough not to care for bells. The Sounder's body lay as if asleep with smoke creeping from his mouth like a polite ghost departing a bad house. The horn lay a little to one side, darker than it had been and heavier, or so it seemed to Victarion, who lifted it and found his shoulders protest. He did not set it down at once. The dragons were aloft, circling. They had come to prefer height to any stone or deck. When they grew tired, they did not tire as men do. They changed the way their wings worked and went to where the air held them with less effort. They had not flown out to sea. They had not left. They had remembered the call, and they were not certain what it bade them do, now that the calling had learned to silence. They wheeled over the ironborn hail of small cheers and the more dignified silence of silence. They looked down with eyes like points of light in water that has gone very deep. Victarion's heart hit his ribs with the blunt end of a hammer and told him, in its stupid, honest way, that joy and terror and pride were all some one thing just then. "Brother," Euron said softly from silence's stern, and Victarion turned his head as if he were a dog hearing a step he loved and despised. Euron's blue eye was bright. "You see? Perhaps I should thank you for keeping my horn warm. You have done as I asked and as you wished, and we are both served." Victarion's jaw moved once. The words that came were dull from the long sail. "They burn well," he said. Euron's smile put no warmth into the world. "Everything does, given time and the right tongue to teach it." There were to be answers and counteranswers, demands and bargains, in the hours and days to follow. There were to be emissaries who came out from Meereen waving cloths and trembling with rage. They called honor, and fear they called prudence. There were to be slavers who offered and freedmen who cursed, and men who saw that a certain girl had left the city on a certain black dragon some days past, and wondered whether that fact could be devoured also. But for the moment, there was only a deck, a horn, 2 dragons, and the men who looked at them with the eyes of boys pressed to the slats outside a brothel. Victarion did not notice when the dusky woman came to his shoulder. She smelled of clean skin and a little of the oil she used in her hair. Mokoro stood not far off, his eyes tilted up, his lips bent to the shape of a prayer in a tongue whose syllables did not sit comfortably in ironborn ears. The sun was nothing but a pale line scraping at the sea's back. The dragons climbed and were now only shadows upon the thin light, and then they were gone to sight, though not to hearing. The air took the memory of their wings and made of it a thrum like a broken harp string. "Call them again," Victarion said. He did not look at Euron when he spoke. He kept his eyes upon the place where the dragons had been. "When the light grows, let the city see what comes when iron asks." "We will," Euron said, and his tone made it unclear whether he spoke in the straightforward ironborn way or in one of those other ways he had learned in other beds in other cities. Victarion set the horn down very gently. As a mother sets a child she does not trust upon a table, she distrusts even more. He flexed his fingers. There was a tremble in them he did not confess to himself. He looked at the dusky woman and thought, for just a moment, of a little house far from any sea in a land that did not smell of salt, where a man might own a field and the most dangerous thing he would ever lift would be a rake with a broken tooth. The thought came like a gull blown far inland, absurd and hungry. He let it go. On the heights of Meereen, in a room hung with silks that had been the pride of a caravan from Kor 3 years ago, an old knight looked out at the smoking water and thought of duty the way a man thinks of an old horse he has loved, and ridden so long he no longer hears its hooves. In a camp south of the walls, men in yellow cloaks argued about which god had allowed this insult to reach their shore, and whether gold or blood or both would remedy it. Far away, upon Black Wing, a girl curved over a landscape unfamiliar even to people born there, her hair pulled backward by the strength of the wake, and she felt in some private pocket of her blood the echo of a horn and did not know if she was being called or warned. Euron went into the belly of his small boat and knelt where the ribs were, and the tar smelled strong, and he pressed his forehead to the plank and said to the god of the deeps, "If this is your will, then I will drown where you say drown. But you have never been a god of fire." And he waited to see if the water would rise and take him. It did not. It slapped upon the hull and spoke in its old voice, patient, which is anger without end. When the day took hold at last, Marine's harbors showed what the night had made of them. Smoke coiled from the middens of ships down to their ribs. Men went bobbing like fruit past the noses of boats that had nothing to do now, and the air had the metallic taste of old pennies you cannot wash from your tongue. The dragons were two black notches cut out of the rising blue, mere gulls to a man who had not watched them close. They slid to the north and hung there as if reading something written on the water. Victarion lifted his hand to the horn. The dusky woman lifted her eyes to him with the little question that is not a question. Mokoro's hands were empty. He liked his hands empty when miracles were near. Victarion did not give the word yet. He waited. He looked to Euron. His brother leaned upon the rail of silence with a grace he had not earned and would keep forever. Euron's head was tilted, as if he were listening to a song no one else could hear. He did not move his mouth, and yet in Victarion's head there came the old sound of boyhood days when Euron taught him to hold his breath and come up laughing. "We will go west," that remembered voice said. Careless and intimate at once. "Not yet. But soon. This city will pay for its lesson and think itself lucky to do so. Then we will be gone from this stink of spiced mud. We will be kings of wind and hunger. We will set our table at Old Town and at Lannisport, and we will feed on bright people whose walls used to comfort them. And then, brother, we will go to speak to religion in its own houses. Are you ready to drown a god? Have you ever thought what it would sound like if one drowned? Would it make a horn note? Would the gulls fall?" Victarion gripped the horn so hard the skin whitened along his knuckles. He could not tell if the voice was his own memory or something that had traveled back along the line between horn and dragons and found his brother's lips along the way. He did not care. He set his jaw and turned toward his men, who looked to him as they had always looked, with the old trust that has weight like chain. "Load the bows," he said. "We go in slow. We show them our teeth. We will not ask. We will take." His voice was iron on iron. "What is dead may never die." The men roared it back. It sounded small under that sky. The horn lay upon the table, quiet for now, a piece of old sin. Its runes looked as they always had. In the city a bell began to toll. A sound no less human than the horns was unhuman. On the heights some flag changed color from gold to white, or perhaps the wind changed its mind about which side of the cloth it wished to favor. The dragons slid sideways along the wind as if testing the hand of a new rider. They were bound, but not tamed. Their heads tilted, and their pupils narrowed to points like sewing needles pushed through a white sheet. The day was only just begun, and the work of it could fill a life. Victarion lifted his hand to give the word, and the sea lifted as well, a long, low swell that took the fleet under and up with the slow care of a great creature that has woken and remembered it has a back that must be stretched. Euron's prayer did not end. It simply became another kind of breathing. Euron's eyes shone like a thing one might use to start a fire on a cold day. The horn would sound again. The dragons would answer. The new tide would run. Men with old names would learn new letters. And the world, which is made of water and fire and the stubbornness of stones, would choose which of those it loved best, for a time, before it chose again. And now, Victarion's hand cut the air, and the oars went in with a sound like a single breath. The crescent of longships slid, keels whispering across the faint chop, the narrow bows parting the green-brown water without fuss. The sea falling away and rejoining after each prow, as if embarrassed to have been disturbed. Shields lifted to the gunwales, a wall of iron and paint, wet and uncomplaining. The Iron Victory took her place in the curl of the arc as a sword settles to its scabbard. Men shifted their weight and became heavier. That was how a crew told you it was ready. In Meereen, bells tolled and found no answer. A long smoke lay close upon the harbor like a wounded animal that did not know whether to flee or to lie down. The first of the Yunkish ships, fat-bellied, steep-stemmed, was still a bowl of fire lit white in the heart and yellow at the lip, listing toward a pier as if yearning for stone. The dragons were dots to a sky-blinded man, but to eyes that had learned distance upon an empty horizon, they were plainly two creatures held lightly in the hands of the air. Circling, banking, their tails riding small careless lines across the pale sun. Steady, Victorian said. And the word went along the deck, as a hand passes down a rope. Men answered it by not moving. The dusky woman stood at his shoulder, veil loose across her mouth, though she did not need a veil. She had taken once what the world had to take, and the world could not take her voice twice. Mokoro was a shadow on the quarterdeck, his eyes lifted toward the little black shapes above the city, as if he were reading a passage written in some script too small for others to see. Silence held the center of the line. It made no sound because Euron wished it so. Where other ships groaned and murmured, old planks stretching in heat and then contracting as spray cooled them, old ropes gossiping under load, silence gave up nothing. Men there had learned to express themselves with the economy of oars. Euron stood as if he had grown from the sternpost, long coat falling straight, black patch in elegant negation, blue eye bright the way a knife is bright in half-light. "Loose," Victorian said when the range was proper, and 100 heavy bows spoke in the same rude tongue. Arrows went. They arced like small arguments, some persuasive, some not, into the nearest ship that still hoped to be a ship and not a memory. Men on her deck lifted their arms to swat at those incoming truths, and discovered their arms were made of flesh. A Yunkish banner dipped and tried to stand up again and did not. Smoke made everything less certain and more vivid at once. Victorian could not count faces, but he could see the instant a man went from a figure with a history to a fresh weight in the world's hand. The horn lay within reach upon the table. The table was only planks hammered upon a barrel, and yet the horn made it into an altar by existing on it. Its runes were dull as old iron until the light glanced them, and then they were deep as a well and slick as blood. The rim where Victorian had pressed his thumb and let a bead of himself fall was still marked by a stain darker than the red gold. The sounder chosen for the day knelt near, his mouth a tight line, his eyes having learned that he was meat and choosing to go on all the same. Victorian did not glance to Euron. He would not give his brother the little joy of being looked to. He slid his mind along the line of the fleet, feeling the distance in his bones as if each ship were a knuckle, and the space between them a joint. He gave the word, and the sounder took the horn up with both hands as a man lifts a bride across a threshold he doubts. The first note was like a door slamming inside a mountain. The second scraped its way down the inside of a skull to the place where fear keeps its hoard, and stirred it with 2 fingers. The third was nothing at all, and that nothing was so total that men gripped for rail or rope lest they fall off the world into it. The gulls that had not yet learned last night's lesson learned it now. Dogs went to their bellies without complaint, ears flattened. On the pyramid a boy at a tower slit, forgot the story he had told himself about his own courage, and let his spear slip. In the shadowed long halls, where once a city's masters had walked in sandals that whispered, a brazen beast with the head of a jackal lifted his iron mask to press his hand to his ear, and then let it fall again with shame at his own weakness. Far below, in stone places where the air had no business being so warm, the chains moved in their own good time, and then did not move at all, because there was nothing left in them to encircle. The green creature came into the light with a body that knew the dimensions of the space before his head did. He shoved stone aside as if it were snow. The pale one made a hissing sound at the world as if taste-testing it afresh. Heat spilled out behind them, pursuing them like a beloved hound. They were not summoned. They were named. They turned south to the line of galleys again, because someone had taught the horn the name of the man who wished it. And the horn told that name to the part of the dragons that remembered hatching alone in heat. They came with the confidence of princes in a city with no king. Flame fell where Victorian pointed with a wordless intention sharpened to a brow crease. Flame licked where Euron had already imagined it licking, and smiled for the memory. "Bored," Victorian said, when the second Yunkish stern let itself be eaten, and he did not need to say it twice. Hooks flew. Lines went. The long ships kissed the enemy hulls with a grunt. Men jumped, their boots taking the old tricks of balance from a lifetime among moving planks. Iron men met silk men, and explained iron to them in a series of short, convincing sentences. There's a grammar to boarding, and the ironborn spoke it without thinking. Knee, elbow, edge, heel, lift, push, duck, stab, breath. A man in yellow tried to bring down a hammer bigger than his own opinion, and met Victarion's shield instead. The shock rang through wood into arm into chest and turned into a useful anger. Victarion went through him the way a ship goes through a paper boat. On the city side, at the foot of the great steps where the market had only just begun to remember what it sounded like, Barristan Selmy stood in mail that had learned this heat badly and regretted it. The old man's hair, white and thin, plastered to his skull with sweat. His sword hung in his hand as easily as if it had belonged there since birth. It had. He had slept poorly, if this which had occurred within a night could be called sleep. Dreams had come like birds in a rafters, restless, noisy, unhousebroken. And he had risen when the bells began, as he had always risen, quickly and with respect for the hours of other men. He watched the harbor through a film of smoke and felt a kind of tired admiration. He had seen dragons as a boy and not very close. He had told himself that a man must fight the foe before him and leave the making of legends to poets and to fools. And yet the creatures in the sky were not a boy's story. They were the fact before him. Skahaz Mo Kundak, the Shavapate, came to him out of heat and clamor with iron on his face and impatience riding his shoulders. The mask made his voice a thing that ought not fit through the shape of a human mouth. "Bold knight," Skahaz said, "the Yellow City will be sending envoys with tongues, and we should answer with knives. They think to bargain while their ships burn." "Then sure. Then let them think so," Barristan said, courteous even now. "Bargaining men do not ride out to cut your throat while their mouths are open. Deter them without insult. We have enough enemies. We need not make new ones out of men who have just learned what fear is. They will name your mercy treason to their gold," Skahaz said. His eyes within the jackal's hollow were hot coals. "Perhaps," Barristan allowed, and drew a small line in the air with his forefinger as if setting a word down upon a page only he could see. "But there is treason and treason. What matters is not what name is given, but what harm is done to those to whom you are sworn. To whom are you sworn today, Skahaz?" Skahaz made a small impatient movement that made the jackal sneer without meaning to. "To the city," he said, which meant to himself as well, to the faction for which he wore iron. He glanced back toward the pyramid. "To the queen, if she lives to be sworn to. Your dragons belong to her." "Do they?" Barristan said. There was no irony in him. He wore sincerity the way he wore steel, with comfort learned from long habit. "Look again." He lifted his chin toward the line of ships and the two black shapes that played above the first of the masts. "Listen." They listened. The sound came thin with distance but sure, like the singing of a saw run across the edge of a plank. It was not a trumpet, not a town bell, not a call any man ought know. It spoke of depth and heat, and of names uttered at the moment. A child took breath. Skahaz's eyes narrowed in their lair. Barristan had the decency not to say what he thought, that a horn was calling, and that it called not to Meereen, but to the sky. The old knight did not know horns that called dragons, but he knew the feeling of command and the look of obedience, and he had never seen the queen's creatures obey any horn. "They will use them to force terms," he said simply. "They are not here for walls. They are here for leverage. They are ironborn." Skahaz spat. "Leverage is a word men who do not enjoy drowning use for drowning men. Their terms will be knives." "Knives then," Barristan said, courteous again, steady as a man buckling a second spur. "We must prepare to accept or to refuse them without dying. See that the brazen beasts hold the lower gates. Post archers on the steps with patience in their quivers. No shooting at dragons. It wastes arrows and angers stories. Keep your cuts for flesh. Thine mercy." Skahaz muttered. But he went, because he had to admit the old man's calm made a sense his rage would not. His Dar, Zol Lorak, had not yet decided upon his manner that morning. He stood in a high room where the wind came troubled through screens of carved stone, and looked down upon ships burning in water reflecting flame, and told himself, like any man who had been taught that he was born to decide, that he must decide quickly. His robe was the color of fresh millet. His face shone with sweat. He found that he was angry that the heat had stolen the dignity from his skin. He had not given permission for his body to forget it was a prince's. "Send for the Yellow City lords," he said to no one in particular, because there were always someones there, and two someones ran, and one tripped and almost fell and did not, and that was the story of his rule thus far, and Hisdar felt the sourness of it like a diet of grapes gone wrong. Below, among the Ironborn, Euron Damfair uncoiled from prayer as a snake uncoils from its own shape, when the sun at last warms it. His hair hung in ropes wet with honest sea, and with the water he had poured on himself to imitate drowning. His ribs showed as the ribs of a boat show when the tide takes sand away from it and reveals its underwork. He stared upon the horn lying in its sly innocence, and felt an old grief claw him again. In the night he had dreamed of a god with a mouth full of water failing to speak because some other mouth had put iron into the god's lungs. He shook once, a contempt thrown toward fear, and set his bare feet carefully upon the deck, moving as a man moves in a chapel when he will not step upon the stones whose names he does not honor. The horn called again. It called as a priest calls, beautifully, insistently, with the certainty of righteousness. It called with Euron's name bound in it like a nail through wood. Euron tasted the bitterness of it at the back of his throat, and desired to vomit up not food, but the world's error. He looked to his brother. Euron did not look back. Euron did not need to look. He had looked when the horn first spoke, and decided that looking was for men who still needed to be convinced. Victarion's battle came on him as all his battles did, in parts. The part that was hands and feet, and the part that was mind, and the part that was a stone in the belly, that did not move, and did not permit fear past. He found himself on a Yunkish deck without quite recalling the steps that had brought him there. That was nothing new. He left a man on the planks with a wound in his throat that tried briefly to decide whether it was larger than the man was, and then concluded it was. He barreled forward and into the busy confusion like a bull into a lane of market stalls, using his armor as a sleeve and his shield as a second forearm. He took a cut upon his vambrace and learned the weight of the man behind it by the way the blow traveled. He pivoted, gave back that weight with interest, then took a breath, and discovered he had found a little spare room in which to think. "Grapnels off," he roared when the galley had the decency to begin dying in a way that would not betray them. "Pull." The ropes came off as clean as snakeskins. Men pushed with feet and shoulders, another set pulled with their backs to boards. The long ship slid free with a boy's laugh of relief, and they were off, leaving behind a smoking deck whose flames reached after them like a lover's hands a moment too late. They made the arc again. They found another target to love with hatred. It was a language Victarion spoke better than any Valyrian word. The horn sounded, and the dragons obliged, and the men of Meereen on the walls learned to keep their heads down, while the towers learned nothing. Moqorro did not pray loudly. He kept his god in his mouth the way you keep a taste of something you like between tongue and tooth. He watched the bigger of the two creatures make a shallow pass and set the roof of a river warehouse alight, because it had an orange awning and pleased its eye. He saw Victarion's glance flick toward Euron, and then away with the precision of a man who knows exactly how much he has not said aloud. He went down from the quarterdeck for a time and found the place below where he had laid out a bowl of oil and 3 sticks of fragrant wood that were Kuhori's pride 100 years ago, and a knife that had never tasted human blood. He pricked his own thumb now, and let a bead fat as a grape fall into the bowl. It made a sound like a fish kissing a skin of water. He whispered to the fire as if he were asking it to marry him, and not telling it it must. When he returned to the deck, he found the world had altered by the amount a heartbeat alters a battle. The biggest of the Yunkish ships, a showpiece with a beak that had once been carved to resemble a lion, and then gilded and then re-gilded when the first gilding offended someone's sense of newness, was trying to backwater out of the harbor, and finding that ships do not move as quickly backward from fate as men can. Its oars fought the tide with the misery of old men made to carry furniture that did not belong to them. The pale dragon came upon it not as a hawk stoops upon a hare, but as a boy throws a torch into a barn for the noise and the light. It flamed across the beak, and the gilding ran and warped, and the lion's face looked astonished as metal learned what heat really meant. Men in the waist of the ship flung down buckets with the offense of practical men losing to beauty, and scattered like quail. "Signal," Euron called then. And though his voice was no louder than a conversational man's voice at a harbor tavern table, Victarion heard him and felt something in his spine. A black flag went up from Silence's mizzen. A simple square with a single silver slit cut through it in the shape of an eye. The oars of Silence did not change their manner. They lengthened their stroke. She slid like a well-oiled lie through the press, and took her place where a gap made itself. And Euron lifted his hand and then a finger, a single finger, and crooked it toward the nearest of the circling shapes, as a man calls his dog. It came. Not straight. Not as a subject comes when called into a presence it fears and loves. It came as a bored boy comes to a sweet he has been promised, with a laziness that is not truly lazy, but has been learned for effect. It passed over Silence's mast, and turned upon its own wing, and dropped until heat lay nice upon the oiled black planks and men's lips cracked in its breath. Its eyes were bright as bottle glass from the summer isles. It tasted the air. It looked at Euron, and then at Victarion, and then at the horn lying a ship's length away upon a table that might have been an altar, and might have been a kitchen board. It settled, and its claws, black as night, gripped the heavy rail as delicately as a resigned lover takes a hand. No one on Silence spoke. That was a rule. Rules sometimes save lives when gods and kings are busy elsewhere. The dragon's head came down, curious. It sniffed Euron as a dog sniffs a man who has walked through 10 markets, bringing the memory of all those smells upon his clothes. The blue eye returned stare for stare. The patch did nothing at all. The corner of Euron's mouth twitched. He lifted his hand, palm up, offering it the way a man offers bread to a horse whose temper he does not trust. The dragon opened its mouth. Heat breathed out and made Euron's black hair sweat on his neck. His rings glowed a little. On another deck, dozens of heartbeats away, Euron Damfair felt the world decide upon blasphemy. "Brother," Victarion said, a warning that had a plea under it as a rock has a buried stain of iron. "Shh," Euron cooed. Not to Victarion. The dragon's tongue flicked. It smelt the metal and the meat of him. Its teeth were sword-broad and spear-long, and there were bits of char caught in the meat between them like pepper in a roast's fat. It closed its mouth again and made a small sound that was nothing like a cat, and everything like a furnace adjusting its draft. Mokoro's hand was upon the rail. Victarion did not remember seeing him move to the ship, and yet there he was, the glare of the creature's heat setting an idea of red into his beard. "Not yet," Mokoro murmured, and Victarion realized that the priest spoke to him and not to the dragon. "I will tell you when the fire can be a cloak and when it is a mouth. To go now is to go naked." Euron held the dragon's eye as if the two of them were matching wills in a tavern game involving knives and the tops of hands. "You like the taste of iron in the air," he said. "I know you do. It speaks to something old in you. Flames have tongues. The tongue you have is a cleverer one. Bedim." It seemed for a moment an obscenity that a man should speak to so strange a beast as to a woman in a bed. Victarion felt anger go through him like a simple harvest tool through stems. He had never been a man for pretty talk. He was a man for force properly applied. "Backwater," he ground out between teeth. "Shift to starboard. Give them room." He would not have his men on Silence be the ones charred into sculptures if the creature changed its mind about the courtesy of stillness. He would not give Euron a death like a story. He would like to give Euron death like a fact. He set men moving with small gestures that did not jar the moment, did not pull the dragon's eye in the wrong way. He watched his brother's hand. Those rings, hovering too close to those teeth. The dragon turned its head as if remembering something. Its pupils pinhole. It lifted away in a soft unfurling of membrane that made a sound like silk, shaken by many quick hands, and then it was up again and away and made to read its same old sentence in the sky a second time. Euron breathed out, and the breath was the one thing like a human word Silence would allow itself. "See," he said, and he smiled at Victarion. "I feed what I love, and it does not bite me for the trouble." Victarion did not answer. There were a dozen answers in him, and none that would come out without dragging half his heart with it. He looked to the horn. Mokoro's eyes dipped to it as well. The runes were not quite as they had been. They were the same runes. But a man who knows letters knows when a sentence has gathered an extra weight from the last time he read it. The horn had learned something and been fed. It was difficult not to think of a name. Envoys came, because they always do, and it is the way of men in bright robes to believe that a cloth beats flame if it is the right color. They came out under white, and their boat rocked under the clumsy suddenness of their haste. They had voices high with anger and with the memory of fear. They waved and were cautious in their waving, the way you wave to signal a man with a mad dog that you are good and bland meat. Euron did not go to them. He sent Victarion. It was a good choice from many angles, and Euron always chose from many angles. Victarion took 2 boats and 10 men, and the dusky woman, because her silence seemed like an omen, and he went to listen to men who had never learned that Ironborn do not listen long. They were proud even now, the Lords of Yellow. Their pride was a stink you could smell in a wind already dedicated to other stenches. Their leader had a cap whose rim was a confusion of little tassels, and whose crown was high in the useless way a useless man's hat is high. Sweat made butterflies on his robe. "You will be paid," he said by way of greeting. The way men who believe their coin to be destiny greet raiders in a world that has not learned that lesson to their taste. Your grievance is with dragons. Meereen is a matter for Meereen. Victarion could have explained to him the structure of grievance as Ironborn conceive it, wherein the only map is the horizon and the only boundary is where your bones meet brine. He did not. He watched the man's mouth shape words and waited until the mouth had fatigued itself. He found the moment when the mouth wished for air and for acknowledgement. "You will pay," he said then gently, because gentleness from a man like him is the least gentle thing in the world. "In gold and in men and in grain and in wine. You will give us the ships you built to carry your profitable horses. You will give us the horse bells too. My brother likes the noise. We are," the Lord began, and found he could not continue on the path he had set. Behind him, on the water, the pale dragon made a neat, small gout, and showed a boy in a small boat what it is to be suddenly very faithful to rowing. The Lord's hand flapped once, then returned to clutch the tassels of his cap as a drowning man might grasp grasses on a bank that will not bear his weight. "If we pay thieves, we encourage thieving," he tried. "You encourage drowning when you do not pay," Victarion said. Same softness, and the Lord discovered that whatever he had believed about pity was a misconception born of looking at his own face in polished bronze too often. The turns were made on the water because pride prevents men from setting foot where they feel small. Victarion named, and the envoy hemmed and scribbled in the head, and tried to think how he might delay with honor, and Euron on his black deck watched all this as if it were a farce performed for his physician in a hot city for a king who knew he was dying. The dragons circled. They were not patient, but they were entertained by their own memory. They kept away from the city after a time, because the smell of stone bored them. When Victarion returned with promises and the first tubs of coin, Mokoro came to him on the gangplank and set a heavy hand upon his forearm. "Tonight," the priest said softly, "when the dark is like last night's dark, when the wind is low enough that you can hear your own blood, that is when you go into fire." "I have gone into fire," Victarion said in a voice that might have been a laugh if it had remembered how. He pulled his arm and made the motion a man makes when he adjusts his cuff, and not when he frees himself. "I stood in my God's water until I thought my breath would not return. He returned it. He marked me. Why do I need your marks?" "Damnation." Mokoro looked toward the dragon that had coasted low over the river and had stolen a goose from some woman's larder without meaning to. It played with the goose a little and then forgot it. "Because your God does not teach dragons the words that permit men to climb their backs," he said with a patience that was not insulting. "You mean to master this horn. It is your brother's. Its obedience is his. Men have known worse thefts. To take it from him without hands, you need another art than ore knowledge. Your body must carry heat and not be cooked by it. Your mouth must be able to say a name back to a horn that was made to hear only one master. My God can put pitch in your lungs instead of water. Will you breathe it?" "And now," Victarion did not love riddles, and he did not love debt to gods, not even his own. But the air coming off the city's burning docks was hot and sweet and wrong. And the horn glittered, and the dragon's eye had looked at Euron, and then at him, and then away, as if it did not mind him, but did not respect him either. "Tonight," he said ungraciously. "That is a small word," Mokoro said, and smiled into his beard. Euron Damfair watched them with eyes that had seen too many baptisms end badly. He found himself thinking of Asha suddenly, the niece with the quick mouth who should have been king, and had not been, who had shown him a kind of blasphemous tenderness by laughing in his ear when other men trembled. He wanted to tell her that this, of all the sins their line had committed, was the most beautiful, and that made it the worst. He wanted to tell her that he would fix it. He did not know yet how to find his way to the fixing. He felt the shape of it as blind fingers feel the seam in two boards. He knew a seam meant prying. He went to the horn when no eye wished to watch him. It lay upon soaked wood like a serpent that had eaten, and was slow with it. He put his hand upon it, as a man puts his hand upon the head of a child he does not think is his. Heat lapped at him. He saw, not with his eyes but with something else that did not have a name he could bring up to his tongue. A furnace banked with ash, a woman with hair white as salt and eyes violet as shallow water, at dusk looking up in a room with pillars, a shadow standing where she had stood once and had left heat behind. He drew back his hand. He had the taste of iron in his mouth, and of smoke. He concluded his god had permitted him that touch, and had not killed him for it, only so Euron might tell the tale of how wrong the horn was, when it killed him later. "Priest," Euron said from behind him, and Euron had not heard him come, which was a sin of inattention. "You have been very quiet. I wondered if you had been drowned to death, and did not know it." Euron turned. "I am quiet in the presence of things that do not deserve speech," he said. He did not look at the horn now. He looked at his brother's eye. "You were a boy once who loved to hold breath under water and rise laughing. You have since taken air into your lungs that men ought not breathe, and now you laugh without ever having been under. It is not the same laugh." "Isn't it?" Euron said, amused. The patch looked like a man's night, the blue like an eye set in the prow of a ship for luck. "We shall go west," he added conversationally. "In time. We have a few friends to make first. Old Town is full of boys who like books and bells. I will give them a new bell to love. The Reach will burn like a field of ripe wheat in a dry summer, and we will stand with our mouths open to catch the seeds. I had thought to be content with a seat made of driftwood and a crown hammered out of old planks. The horn has given me appetite. You will bless this meal, brother, or you will be drowned in the bowl." "No. I will drown you at last," Euron said, not loudly, so the god might hear him and not the men. Euron smiled as a man smiles when a friend tells him an old joke in a room that is new to both of them. The day wore itself thin with heat and smoke and bargaining. Maraine's envoys learned to phrase delay as duty and duty as delay. Victarion learned that the coin of Slaver's Bay was heavy with the weight of men's backs and fell with a nice noise into matters. Euron learned little. He had come already knowing many things. The dragons learned a new game: to tilt low enough above a crowd that the crowd would scatter and scream, and then to tilt away again, laughing with their bodies and their tails, making rude gestures at fear. At sunset, Barristan Selmy watched orange lay itself upon the black, and thought of a boy in King's Landing long ago, who had walked beside a prince with silver hair, and had admired how the light had made a tower look as if it were made of copper. He did not know if he would die here. He had decided long ago not to be concerned with the where of his death. He was concerned, always, with the why. He had sworn to a girl with eyes like old kings' tapestries. Until she released him or died, his why had already been decided. He sent a small troop to hold the eastern gate on the lower wall, because there is always a gate men will forget, and he had learned to remember them. He spoke quietly with a brazen beast whose child had been born lame, and who had chosen to wear the head of a fox to make him seem cleverer than he felt. He drank water that tasted of the vessel that had held it, which had once held wine. He did not look too long at the dragons, because he had learned at last that looking too long at anything steals something from a man's store of sense. Night grew up from the edges of the world and stood, and the harbor wore a sheen of reflected stars, as if the gods had spilled their shaving bowl. On the Iron Victory, Mokoro's bowl burned with a steady, low flame. He had set upon the deck a circle of charcoal mark, no bigger than a meat platter, and no smaller than a shield's face. He asked Victarion to step within without taking off his boots. Victarion did so. He had known sailors to balk at stepping into circles, and he despised them for it. He was not a dog to be turned aside by paint. The dusky woman stood at the edge of the mark with her hands folded, as if waiting upon a midwife. "Breathe," Mokoro said. "The air is a thing you must learn again. You have known it only as wind and as something to fill your cheeks when you dare a wave. Now it will be weight. It will be food. Take it in as if it were a heavy stew, and your mother's eye were on your spoon." Victarion stared at him, the line of his mouth stiffer than the metal he wore. He did as he was told, because you do as you are told in battle, when the order comes from a man who has not yet shown himself a fool. He breathed. The smell rising from the bowl was of cinnamon and pitch, and of something like the back of a smithy. It found his throat and coated it. He felt heat move into him, through a place that was not his mouth, and not his skin. It came through memory, perhaps, through the part of him that remembered campfires and tallow candles, and the first time he had warmed his hands above a brazier after coming in frozen from reefing a sail in a wet gale. His eyes stung, and then did not. Mokoro murmured words. They were not prayers a man could mistake for the drowned gods. They flowed, and they had those soft, rich stops and starts you hear when a merchant counts coin into his own hand at night to comfort himself. He took something from the bowl with his thumb and forefinger and traced lines along the inside of Victarion's wrists, where veins showed blue like ropes under skin. He touched the places above Victarion's heart. He set his palm upon the Iron Captain's brow. It was like the touch of a brand pulled just at the right moment from the fire, hotter than skin can bear, cool just enough to teach and not to mar. "You will be burned," he said plainly. "The world is not made in such a way that a man can avoid that. But you will not be cooked. You may stand where men cannot and still choose your next step. When the horn sounds, you will feel less of it as pain and more of it as a word. Between the word and your will there is a small door. Keep that door open." "I am no mummer to make doors in my head," Victarion said. He felt his heart beating faster. He could count it without counting. "You are a captain," Mokoro replied. "You have kept worse doors open in worse weather." He took up a piece of iron he had heated in a small brazier not far off. It was a ring, and the ring had been forced open so that its ends did not meet. He pressed it to Victarion's right wrist, and the Iron Captain did not cry out, though the flesh sizzled. The priest pressed the ends together with thick fingers that should not have been able, and made the ring whole. He did the same to the left. The room seemed to turn about the space within the circles and the bowl. The stars felt closer in that moment than the cleats under Victarion's boots. "Go," Mokoro said when the night had learned to hold its breath. "Stand in the dragon's look. Call it. Do not command it. Command will come after you have shown it that the fire does not own you. The horn will want to name your brother. Let it. Then say your own name back to it without moving your lips. That is your door." Victarion went to the rail with the stench of his own cooked skin in his nose, which is a smell most men cannot carry without shuddering. He held it in place the way a sober man holds a shivering friend. He lifted his head and found the sky again. The dragons were not easy to find at once. Everything black is anonymous until it moves. Then he saw one tilt in front of a star and steal it for a heartbeat. He fixed his gaze and kept it fixed. The oar song of the fleet had gone long since. The creak of lines had grown quiet. Only a murmur like a low prayer remained. He set his hands upon the rail and felt the old ship talk to him through the grain of her wood. "Now," he said, and the sounder lifted the horn and put it to his lips and closed his eyes against the pain he knew was coming. It came. Victarion felt the world try to crawl into his mouth. He felt his chest want to crumple. But something oily and sweet lay along his palate now, and the pain could not find purchase where it needed. It slid. It skated. It spoke to him as a word speaks to a man learning a language. He heard Euron's name, not spoken as men say names, but as names are said by beasts, to whom names are taste and smoke. He did not reject it. He let it through. He opened the small door. He did not know what he did exactly, but he found an old place in himself, where he had once held his breath, until he had seen stars without moving his eyes. He found he could be there again. He put his name in that place as a weight upon a table that threatens to tip. Victarion Greyjoy, he said, and the saying of it made the horns sound tilt very slightly, as a man's head tilts when he hears a sentence he had thought he understood, and now is not sure he does. Victarion felt fire upon his skin. He understood then that it was air. He held it. He did not fight it. He let the name of Euron pour through him, and felt the insult of it, and did not close his teeth upon that insult. He let it have his mouth, and then replaced it with his own name, the way a captain replaces a man at an oar, when the man has pulled himself empty. The dragon came. It came lower than before. It came, and in coming, spoke back. It spoke in heat upon his face, and in a smell, and in a sound like the drawing of a sword you cannot see. It hovered as if thinking. Its head came down and swung left and right, cautious and curious. It looked at him the way big dogs look at men who do not flinch. Victarion did not flinch. He turned his eyes to water, and he blinked as a man blinks at grief. He lifted his hand. He did not reach to touch. He had no wish to insult something that could make an insult the last act of his hands. Down, he breathed, and did not mean down to him but down out of the sky where it was safest, and into danger where men live. The dragon's pupils widened and then narrowed again. It hissed a thought into the air and then dropped until its claws briefly tapped the outer rail of the iron Victory and scored it. The sound went through the wood into the ship's spine, into Victarion's bones, into the horn for a heartbeat. Euron's name leapt within that horn like a fish thrown upon a jetty. Victarion said his name back to it very softly in the place that was the door. The dragon turned its head as if irritated, and then set it a little aside, and the massive lid slid down and up over the luminous eye. Its breath washed him. It smelled of old ash and blood turned black, and the hot sweetness of fat that had run to the coals. It was a smell men might learn to love if they lost all their good sense. Victarion set his weight. He shifted his feet. He made himself a place to step from. "Daunt," said a voice beside him so soft and human that he turned. The dusky woman. She had put her hand out as if to touch his arm, and then stopped the hand because she knew her touch meant something he might dislike. Her eyes were steady. He did not know from what part of the world she had been taken, but there was a sea in her gaze that did not know his God. Not yet her mouth shaped, though no sound came. The scar across her throat looked the way a bad seam looks in expensive cloth. He did not step. The need to step went through him like a storm and was gone. He let the dragon be. It lifted with the quick grace of something too heavy to justify its own lightness, and went with a whip of its tail that made flags bend upon other decks. The horn sound diminished and then died. The sounder fell and smoked, and the men who took his body away made much of doing it quickly and respectfully, because you have to believe yourself the kind of men who take care of your dead if you want to be the kind of men who win the next fight. "You see," Mokoro said, satisfaction buried in velvet. "You kept the door open. There will be other doors. The horn can be tricked by patience. The day will come when Euron's name will go through you as wine goes through a sieve, and yours will remain in the cup." Victarion put his hand upon the ring at his wrist. It was hot and strangely comforting. He allowed himself the smallest of smiles, which on another man's face would have been a grin. "I will take my brother's horn," he said. He knew that saying so aloud would draw a consequence, and did not mind. The city slept badly. Its sleep was like a man who has given wine to company, and wants them to leave, but has not the manners to make it happen quickly. Dreams came full of color and false friends. Slaves dreamed they were free, and woke to remember that they were, and woke again to find they were not. Masters dreamed of dragons, and woke to find that their money had weight, and that weight might be useful after all. In a great camp south of the walls, where the Yellow City had pitched its arrogance, soldiers coughed and wiped blood from their noses, and called the flux by its pretty mare's name, and pretended it was not in their bedrolls with them. And in the tents of captains men counted losses into tallies made of bone, and talked of the next day as if it were an old acquaintance slow to arrive at supper. Far out upon the moonlit grass where the world was a sound of insects, and the whisper of tall stalks, Drogon settled at last upon a windswept hump and made a bed of his own shadow. The girl with silver hair lay along his back as if she had been born to it, and had only now remembered that fact. The donkey face of a certain Khal stirred in his sleep, and muttered, and kicked another man in the thigh, and then pretended upon waking that he had not. The girl lifted her head and stared into dark, feeling foolish for thinking she had felt another call. It had come earlier like the ache of an old wound, not hers but the world's, and it had made something in her go taut. Drogon had answered not with obedience, never that, but with anger. He had spiraled high and screamed, and 1,000 grazing animals had bolted, and 24 men had flattened themselves upon the grass as if the sky were about to fall. She had put a hand to his neck and whispered nonsense to bring him down. His heat had warmed her. His smell had overwhelmed anything less important. The call had faded to a memory she distrusted. "Not yours," she said to him accidentally, and Drogon snapped at some small shining thing that had the bad manners to fly near his face, and made a sound that a girl could learn to love instead of a lullaby. She slept. The grass ticked. The moon was a slow kind of boat. In the morning, Meereen's envoys returned with more coin, because coin is the best bandage men have invented for pride. They brought wine as well, and fruit in bowls carved from some pale wood that had no business on a ship. They brought threats, wrapped in compliments, and compliments, sharp as knives. They told Victarion softly that if he kept faith, he would be remembered as a great prince in songs sung from the shadow to Korth. Victarion told them in his gentle way that he had no wish to be remembered, and every wish to be fed now. He did not look over his shoulder to see if Euron was laughing. He would not give him the satisfaction of bait taken. Skahaz Mokondak watched all this from a slit, and counted the theater pieces in his head. He thought of what men must be put where within the day to control what must be controlled. He thought of which captains would sell their men for half the promise the Ironborn had just extracted. He thought fleetingly of cutting the throat of the old knight, who told him softly to hold patience. He found he did not want to. That irritated him until he named it respect, and then it irritated him more. He put on a different mask to cover the first, and went down among his beasts, and spoke in short sentences that made men straighten, and take up their spears in the way that meant they were not only obeying but wishing to. Euron Damfair went again to the horn after noon. He had a small knife, and it was not for throat, but for leather. He cut the oiled cloth that had once swaddled the horn to fit his arm. He did this while men slept with their mouths open, and their hands empty because they had been drunk on the heat. He bound his right forearm from wrist to elbow with the cloth, and tied it one-handed with the skill of a man who has tied himself to masts more times than he can count. He kissed neither cloth nor horn because kisses are for things a man loves, and he did not love the horn. He went to the skiff that had been assigned to him as a courtesy and as a cage. He stepped into it and set the oar in its notch, and rowed into the low chop toward the south, where the water grew browner nearer the river's tongue. He meant to drown the horn, not by casting it into deep. He respected deep too much to think it would accept so unclean a guest, but by taking it into the river where the god was less strong and men were more. He meant to give it to filth and to silt, and to small lives with mouths that eat what skin leaves behind. He meant to wedge it under the legs of a pier, and let years do what moments could not. He did not think he would live to watch the years. That was fine at wine. He got as far as a certain line in the harbor where the tide and the rivers push come to argument and forget to speak for a time. There, the skiff rocked in two minds. Euron took the horn in his hands and felt it try to tell him a story. He spoke his god's words over it, and discovered that the words could not find corners in the horn to lodge in. He lifted it high. "Brother," Euron said. He had not been in the skiff a moment before. He was there now, sitting as if he had been invited, every inch of him taking up space like a law. "You will not." Euron did not ask how. It was not a sea trick. It was a man trick, and Euron had learned many in many beds in cities, and on stones men did not step upon with sandals. Euron's hands tightened. The horn pressed into his palms. It was hot, as if a small summer lived in it. "You will not," Euron said again, and he smiled pleasantly. "You will not, because if you do, I will have Moqorro set you alight with one word, and you will meet your god as a cloud of smoke, instead of as a corpse doing honest work. I will not let you choose the manner of your death here." Euron's hatred of him was a very old rope. He tested it. It held. "One day," he said, "you will put your head under, and you will not come up." "One day," Euron agreed cheerfully, "but not before I have stood in the sept of Baelor and listened to the seven scream like gulls with their throats cut." He took the horn from Euron's hands with the gentleness of a lover retrieving a trinket. "Do not force me to salt your eyes," he added almost sadly. "I have loved your certainty. It has a flavor. Keep it to season the next while. You may need it." He set the horn across his knees, as if it were a child asleep, and watched his brother, until the old priest's breath came to him, as breath comes to men who have put their heads too long into barrels. To smell if wine is turned? Euron rode them back himself, and he rode well. It should not have surprised Euron, but it did. There were too many parts of Euron that belonged to boys the sea had made before anything else had claimed them. By dusk of the second day, the Yellow City had paid enough to buy the illusion that it still had choices. Euron gave them the illusion graciously. He meant to take it away again when he had need of another day's entertainment. He declared, because he liked to declare, that his galleys would return in a fortnight to collect the balance. He sent a letter ashore in a hand that was elegant and cruel, as if ink itself could be taught to sneer. In it he asked for a list of items that made men with soft hands blanch: 50 barrels of salt cod because the Ironborn will eat anything if salted, 50 amphorae of sweet wine because Euron liked to drink while the world burned, 40 girls of 9 summers to be sent home to the Iron Islands as bondsmaids because cruelty is a pronouncement, 40 boys of 15 summers to pull oars because oars eat boys, Pectotus appetites, a harp of silver and a harpist who could play it because enjoyed. He sealed it with a bit of red wax pressed with a seal that did not belong to him. He smiled when he passed it to the envoy. The envoy took it with both hands and hated the way his fingers trembled. Victarion watched all this and felt his jaw work. He had not forgotten the dragon's head near his own and the smell of its breath, and the small, slight disciplinary anger in its eye when he did not step onto its back. He did not intend to forget. He turned to Moqorro. "We go," he said. "West. We go when your brother goes," Moqorro said placidly. "And he will not go until he has shown his new toys at more ports than this. He believes in shows." "He believes in himself," Victarion said, which was true as steel. "At night," Moqorro murmured. "Belief is a kind of fire. It can keep a man warm for a while. It can also eat his house. If you are very quiet, you can hear which kind it is." Victarion was not a quiet man. He was learning. The third night, the wind shifted. It came out of the east with a stranger's perfume, and men on decks who had been children on ships in the summer sea lifted their heads and tried to remember names. The dragons did not mind the wind. They mind only the heat and the movement of feasts below them. The horn sounded once early, not to command, but because Euron liked the way it turned men toward him with admiration, and with loathing that they thought he did not notice. It sounded later again near moonrise, and the creatures came low over the river and set a statue's beard alight, because beards are ridiculous. The city groaned against its bricks and settled into its new knowledge, which was that the world had grown a new hinge somewhere, and Meereen was no longer the center of any door. At dawn of the fourth day, Euron had silenced Vir without warning, and split the crescent he had settled the fleet into with a lazy violence. And he pointed her prow out toward the open sea with a gesture of his hand, like a man throwing a bit of bread to a dog he does not care if he loses a finger to. Victarion did not ask. He turned the iron Victory, and the line of bows turned with him. The envoy on the pier shouted and shook a scroll that named promises. The sound of it did not reach men who had learned the grammar of oar and wind. No, Victarion said softly to Mokoro. Now, Mokoro said, studying the sun as if he could read upon it the line of their day. He means to go to Astapor first. He has decided that a city of red bricks and bad manners will be his wine before his meat. Then I will be his knife before his throat, Victarion said. And he would have smiled if smiling did not feel like admitting that words are enough. They went out. The harbor fell away behind the sterns like a lie men have decided to forget. Smoke lay down flat upon the water like a tired soldier. Men breathed more easily once the city's stink was behind them. Euron stood at his place and did not look back because he liked his song better when it did not have a refrain. Behind them, in the high place where the wind never forgets itself, Barristan Selmy watched them go, with eyes that had just enough water in them to make the world brighter. He turned then to the work of men who cannot go chasing monsters. He set in train a dozen small ordinary acts that would hold a city upright for another day. It is the small ordinary acts that make space for legends to strut. He sent a page to the kitchens. He sent 2 brazen beasts to fetch the healer who had hands light as a girl's. He told a captain of Unsullied that he had carried a spear too high for his arm to be good for long. He went to the courtyard where young boys practiced with sticks stouter than their wrists and watched them. He said to one of them, "Lower your left," and said to another, "Do not look at your master to see if he approves. Your enemy will not approve either." He thought then briefly of leaving the city, of going out upon a longship and dying among men who cared nothing for his vows. The thought disgusted him into standing up straighter. He was not done here. He believed in queens. He believed in little boys learning to hold a stick straight. He believed in mornings. Out upon the bluing water, the longships stretched their oars and taught the sea to accept them. The horn lay in Euron's hand with the docility of a thing that has chosen its master. The rings upon his fingers made small bright flashes, light caught, light thrown back. The blue eye was a jewel a god might have pried from a statue and put into a man for a joke. The patch was a piece of night, strapped to a day. He lifted the horn slightly and then set it down again, as a man pats a favored dog and tells it to walk by his side. Victarion felt the door in him where the horn's word had gone through. He found he could open it and shut it, that it obeyed not his hand but some steadiness deeper than hand. He held it open a little, as a man holds a window a crack to smell a rain far off. He thought he could smell burning wheat, and the salt of Lannisport's harbor, and the old stone dust of Old Town's towers, and something that might have been the perfume on some girl's hair years ago, the first time he had pulled her from a cliff path to kiss her in a wind that had tasted like iron. He closed it. He was not a boy. He was a man with iron in his wrists, and a priest's lies in his ears, and a brother he must kill. He put his hand on the rail and felt the world move under him as it had always moved. He could have smiled then. He did not. He looked forward. The dragons rode their own wind, playing, hunting pieces of their own shadow. The Ironborn sang because mouths must work at something when hands are busy, and fear sits behind the teeth and needs company. They sang of women and oars and of kings who drowned with crowns upon. Euron Damfair did not sing. He knelt with his breath carefully counted, and his god, a cold place in him. He told the god a small precise thing, that he would not forgive. He did not ask to be forgiven. He did not believe gods forgive. He believed they sink and they rise, and they grind down men between tide and rock, until those that remain are the shape that pleases them. He was willing to be ground. He was not willing to be horn. The sea beyond Marine wore fewer scars. It lay empty, and then busy, and then empty again. It is difficult to tell men who have never traveled how large the world is. It is like trying to convince a child the horizon is a lie his eyes tell him. The longships told the horizon its secret with each pull. They passed the line of floating graves from the night's work and made no more of them than men make of gulls. They passed a boat with 2 men in it who had lost their oars and were learning how foolish hope can be. The Ironborn took them aboard and made them learn a new word for hope. They passed a patch of water where flying fish rose and men laughed and reached with their hands and caught a few and bit into them, raw with the joy of a day's work begun. The dragons dipped and rose and made their own choices. Euron's choices were a line like the wake of a ship. Victarion could see it if he did not look straight. Astapor would be first. Euron would stand before its low walls of red brick and demand something ridiculous. And the city would give it because it had learned in one day that ridiculous demands can be real. He would use the horn to outrage the sky and the dragons to lick the city's pride and call that a treaty. He would leave a few fires behind him because he did not believe in men who went unpunished after crossing him by being too slow to kneel. Then he would turn and write his mark on Yunkai if the Yellow City had not paid enough. And then he would go west because west pulls at Ironborn like a moon. He would make for Volantis, perhaps because Volantis had just reminded itself how very ancient and very proud it was, and Euron liked to lay new humiliations upon old prides. Or he would skip Volantis, because the tiger is not a dog, and he did not care to be bitten while petting it. He would bend for a moment at Qarth, and take something bright from a shop, without paying either in coin or in courtesy. He would find a way to offend a priest, because offense is one of his foods. He would come to Dorne only hard enough to make a prince their way to his own anger, and then leave again because it amused him to make men speak his name in runes he had never entered. He would come at last to Old Town because Old Town was a room he desired. He would turn the maester's lamps black with smoke and laugh at bells. He would light a candle of his own if he had not already, and it would be green and men would pretend not to smell its stink, and then would smell nothing else ever again. Victarion would kill him before that. He did not know how yet. He knew the when. Not too soon, not too late. He knew the where. Upon a deck, because men from Pike should die upon wood with salt on their lips. He knew the weapon. Not the horn, because that would be too pretty and Euron loved pretty things. The weapon would be something ugly and honest. He thought perhaps his hands. He thought perhaps the ring upon his wrist heated to a glow by a bowl not of this god or that. He thought perhaps drowning in a small tub as simple as the ones children splashed in upon deck when the sun was too cruel. He opened the door in him once more, only a crack, to taste the future. He tasted brine. He tasted ash. He tasted a woman's tears and a priest's laughter, and the sweetness of an apple stolen from a boy who had never eaten meat. He tasted a god who held his breath as if deciding whether to speak. He closed the door. The oars rose and went in. Rose and went in. The world moved forward. When the sun was a flat coin low and red, the first of Astapor's watchtowers came up like knuckles above the dull line of land. The bricks were the red of dried blood, the mortar a paler pink like the inside of a man's lip. The city's breath smelled of red clay and long-dead arguments. The dragons answered the horn one last time before the land took everything out of the air that did not belong to dust. They came glimmering in the low light, their bellies catching the last warmth, their eyes writing little bright signatures upon the day's last page. Euron Crow's eye lifted the horn as a man lifts a cup to drink to his own health. He did not drink. He smiled. He was a man with a fire already inside him and no need of another. Victarion's hand found the hot ring on his wrist and settled there. He looked to the place upon the line of ships where silence moved without moving. He looked ahead to a city that had once made soldiers by breaking boys and had since been broken by a girl who told it that men were not for sale. He felt the door inside him swing on its hinge. He left it ajar. The horn would sound. The dragons would come. Men would decide. The sea would carry the decisions to other shores. And somewhere far upon the grass, a girl would lift her head and frown, because the world was telling her it had made a choice without asking her. She would teach it not to do that. That would take time. There was time. There is always time until there is not. The first oars went in together for the run-in to the red walls. The long ships curved like smiles. The Ironborn sang to drown their own teeth. The horn lifted. The world held its breath. Ah-kay. The horn's first note reached the red walls ahead of them before their oars did. It worked along Astapor's brick and mortar like a worm in hardwood, a pressure that could not be seen, but could be felt in the way dogs flattened their ears and thin. Sunburnt children looked up from the river's rim with eyes like pits. The second note slid over the low towers and into alleys where dust had lain undisturbed for a season, and stirred it. The third emptied the throat of the world for a heartbeat, so even the insects forgot their own names. What came back was not army nor envoy, but smell. Astapor's breath had been wrong since it first learned to bake itself a city out of slaves. Hot clay and piss thrown from windows, the sweet rot of fruit cooked too long in sun, old blood powdered and swept into corners. Now another wrongness rode the first. The pale mare had passed through here and left her prince. The stink of flux was a small god in its own right, and the heat had learned to carry it lightly. The dragons answered, sound the way fire answers dry grass. Without philosophy, with delight. They came down not as conquerors, but as creatures returning to a game that had satisfied them last night. Rhaegal turned upon the low sea wind, wings long and translucent where the sun found thin places, and took the color of beaten copper at the edges. Viserion did a lazy roll that showed the world his pale belly, and then righted, snapping at the nothing of air as if to remind it which of them had teeth. Astapor did not trouble them. Astapor could not. The Butcher King that men had mocked and feared in the same breath was meat now, and the men who had stolen his crown after him were meat that had learned to move into the river or to a ditch and stay there. The Yunkish standards that had hung in certain courtyards to shout ownership had gone sun-bleached to an almost honest color. What soldiers remained upon the walls were tired enough that they could not be properly afraid. They watched dragons with the still eyes of men who have watched fire too often and are no longer certain it is a miracle. Victarion could not smell disease when the wind was from the sea, and the sea was generous with its breath in the first hour on shore. He smelt only brick warming and the faint cook-sweet scent that clung to dragonfire as fat renders. He set his hand upon the rail and nodded once to the sounder. The horn spoke, and the green one stooped, flame ribboning out to paint a slice of the outer wall with a glassy sheen. Brick that had survived 100 summers learned a new quick death. The burn was shaped with the carelessness of a boy at mischief. The white one flamed a up-leaping gust along a street where sheets hung before doorways like surrender flags, and left them in little vortices of ashy lace. Men on the parapet ducked out of pride, and because ducking is the one thing bodies learn without instruction. Silence slid into the roadstead as if there were oil laid out for her along the water. Euron leaned at his place as if leaning were a command. He did not look to see if men looked. They did. He lifted his hand as if to bless a wedding, and the dragon's shadow crossed his face like a scrap of night too lazy to travel with the rest. He smiled with the corner of his mouth. Signal them, Victarion said flat to no one, and the Iron Victory made her flag say what iron-born mouths always say when they must pretend at parley. We have time, but we do not love it. The first boat that came out from the low quay belonged to no lord of Astapor. It belonged to a man in a robe streaked with what had once been yellow and a sash that had known cleaner hands. He was old and had a clerk's stoop. The sun had not been kind to his scalp. He held up both palms, open, to show that he carried nothing but his language. He had a brave tongue and sick eyes. He began, as men in dead cities must begin, with remembrance, naming councils Dany had left and councils men had murdered and councils that had murdered men. He used words like continuity that had nothing to do with the red brick dust on his hem or the black dried rivulets on his sandals. He spoke of tribute as of a right that could sanctify survivors, as if gold could absolve anyone of their past. Victarion listened the way iron listens to rain. He did not interrupt. He did not waste Euron's hunger upon crumbs. You will give us, he said when the clerk had poured himself out, the ships in your basin that still know which end is forward. You will give us grain unspoiled by your little god with the bad manners, and wine that does not stink like medicine. The gold you have is thin even by your measure. Bring it anyway, your brick is good for breaking heads. I will take carts of the best. If you have things you care for, bells, idols, pretty stones, bearing them, my brother luck. Slaves, Euron said from silence, not raising his voice. The blue eye was a glint at the edge of Victarion's sight. They were once the only thing you understood. Show me how much you have learned. The clerk's mouth tightened. We have none, he said, which was a lie men of this city had learned to tell with such waxing conviction, that the lie had taken on a kind of sincerity. Those who thought to sell men were sold or killed. Those who were sold are gone. Then bring me collars, Euron said pleasantly. Empty, if you are holy men now. He smiled. The smile did not reach his eye. And a man who can play a horn sweetly. Not this one. He lifted the black thing in his hand, as if offering to trade. The clerk turned his face aside without meaning to, and sweated into his sash. Astapor's memory had taught it enough practical piety to shower the water with the sound of ropes and the groan of rolls. Barges crept out dragging crates and amphorae that had decided to stand the voyage by sheer stubbornness. Carts came with red bricks stacked like bread, and those who had loaded them could not decide whether to be insulted or relieved that their city's bones were wanted for use as clubs. A boy came carrying 3 bronze collars on his head, as if modeling them, and his mouth was fixed in the stern line boys' mouths take when they are trying not to cry before men. The Ironborn took all with the unembarrassed efficiency of thieves. The dragons watched the work as cats watch ants. When the horn called, they came down to be admired and flamed a fisherman's shed because its thatch was different from the market's thatch and novelty deserved attention. Once, Rhaegal lowered so far that the tips of his claws kissed the river's brown skin, and splayed ripples came away in a beautiful pattern. Viserion snapped a fish from the froth without seeming to try and tossed it once to catch it better. It made a sound like a wet glove hitting a wall when it went down. Mokoro kept close to Victarion through the business of loading. He did not preach. He stood and bore the sun as if he had been born in it, which he had, his beard throwing back the light like a cinder that refuses to go dark. When Victarion said, "Now," he said, "Now back." And each knew what door the other meant. They cleared a stretch along the Iron Victory's starboard where the rail could serve as a cliff. The sounder knelt. Another face, another mouth that pain would make holy in one direction or the other. The horn's rim drank a drop from Victarion's thumb as a matter of ceremony. He spoke the salt words, and did not concern himself with whether the salt god had his ear turned east. He lifted his chin toward the green. It came, disdaining haste, but not disobedience. Heat baked the planks. A dozen men fell back, and then stepped forward again, because their pride learned itself anew. The head, huge, scarred, beautiful in the way a storm is beautiful, swung. The eye took Victarion in. It was not a human gaze. There was no human gaze that had so little interest in reading faces. Its interest lay in movement, shape, scent. It listened to the horn with its bones. Victarion did not reach. He set his feet as he had in winter on a pitching deck, with a hawser gone mean in his hands. He did not blink. The rings upon his wrists were a pain he could count. He drew a breath and felt its heat burn the little hairs in his nose down to sleep. He said his own name, no louder than breath, as the horn said Euron's as if writing law. He felt the tilt, small, inside his skull. The door stood open a finger width. Down, he breathed again. But softer, and not as a command, as a suggestion given to a creature that did not experience suggestions. The neck moved. There was a wink of nictitating membrane over that bright eye. The claw touched wood and cut it, and left a curl like a shaving off a carpenter's bench. The great chest blew. "On," Euron said, not loudly. The single syllable cut, as clean as a new chisel. Mokoro's hand was at Victarion's shoulder without his noticing it arrive there. "Your god will not stand between you and this fire," the priest murmured, tone even, as if offering a friend a cup made sweeter by care. "He is a god of water. I will. I am a god's man of flame." His fingers pressed and left the heat of their imprint through silken mail and skin into nerve. "Go." Victarion did not like to be told to go where another man wished him, but he went because his hatred had learned a practical language. He set his foot where the rail had not splintered, and then upon the angle of the elbow joint, and then his hands found the ridge of a neck where scales ran different and offered grip, and then a knee found a notch in the creature's shoulder, as if some smith had made a ladder for him long before he had been born. He swung. He sat with his thighs screaming protest, and his spine suddenly present to him as if a harp string had been strung along it too tight. He found that the creature's heat was not even. There were places hotter, places cooler, and those places had a shape that he might learn the way a man learns the shape of a wife's back under a blanket. Rhaegal tensed as a horse tenses under wrong hands. The horn held his attention the way meat holds the attention of a hungry dog in a room full of men. Euron's will flowed through that sound like wine through a tube. Victarion felt the insult of it, felt himself made an instrument through which another man's idea moved, and kept his jaw tight shut, because rage is a luxury on a rising back. The first beat of wings was a blow. It shoved air and part of Victarion's mind down toward the deck. The second tore him free of that deck with the rest. The third explained to him that the world was made up of layers he had never imagined, and one of those layers was thin and cold and unexpectedly kind to the lungs. The breath he took up there was like that first breath after drowning, and it told him in a long, slow way that he had been a fool to think he understood moving until now. A shout went up from the deck in the shape of his name. It broke apart in the sky immediately into shreds of sound that went nowhere. Victarion bent lower by instinct as the green neck snaked and the head lifted, and without thinking he put a hand against the base of a neck ridge where the heat was a little less, and found a leverage there. He did not pull. He leaned. It was nothing. It was a flea leaning against a dog. The dog adjusted an ear very slightly. The dragon banked. Astapor fell away. Its red walls simplified to a child's idea of a wall. Its streets were only lines a careless brush had left upon clay. The river was a strap of leather laid along the sand. The sea was a plate turned edgewise to show how much it could hold. The air felt like iron in winter and like the breath of a smith's apprentice. Victarion's eyes watered. He did not close them. He would pluck them out with his own thumb before he gave Euron the sight of him blind upon a dragon. The command came from below, a twist in the horn's drawn-out note, and an intention in it like an oarsman's rhythm. Victarion heard Euron's name again in it, tasted shade and the kiss of a black stone. He did not bar it. He put his own name alongside as if laying a second rope along the first. The dragon's head moved. They came around. The city swam under them, and then above them, and then to their left and right all at once. He learned very quickly not to put meaning to directions, as men put meaning to them on decks. Flame came because Rhaegal wanted it to come. There is no other reason. It wrote itself in white at the core and yellow where it spent itself, and left brick glazed and handsome for a heartbeat, and then blown to shards. Victarion did not cheer. He would not show joy under Euron's hand. He looked down once and saw silence, and a figure small as a toy leaning at her stern, and knew what that toy wanted. He opened his jaw a finger width and closed it again. They flew until the muscles in Victarion's legs shook, and his hands had learned calluses they had never needed before. They flew until he discovered that fear could be taught manners and sit quietly beside awe without spoiling the meal. When at last Rhaegal dropped like a stone and then snapped his wings and took the air in both arms and thrust and came down, he did so not upon deck but upon the cracked flat roof of a storehouse that had once held the tools of men who made men into soldiers. It shuddered and squatted and held them because there was a deep room below, and the joists had been old work, overbuilt by some overseer long dead who had not wished blame. In the street below, a dozen Astapori who had once been free for a moment, and then been hurried back into slavery in a different direction, stared as if saints had pissed upon their shrine. Victarion slid down as a man dismounts a horse after too long upon it, with legs remembering wrong lengths and wrong angles. He put both hands flat upon the hot old brick and felt it through his palm. He felt the heat of the dragon reflected back by it, and thought foolishly of a forge with a wall of brick at its back. He looked up because he had to. Euron was already there upon the roof's edge, a silhouette with a patch and a smile. It was as if the man had been placed here at the making of the building and left waiting for this moment, dusting himself once a year out of courtesy. Well, the crow's eye said, and the soft word had weight. How does the sky taste, brother? Like coin, Victarion said, and the blue eye brightened. It was as close to poetry as he allowed. Mokoro came panting because even priests are men under the sun. He set his hands upon his knees and looked up with a respectable awe he did not waste on Euron. He bowed his head once to the dragon because flame recognizes flame in a friend's house. He reached for Victarion's wrist without asking and touched the ring and grunted, satisfied as a good craftsman, at a joint that is set correctly. Next, Euron said softly in a way a man might speak to a girl with her hair undone in a new bed. Next, we will make it work where it matters. And where is that? Victorian said, though he knew. In a city that has forgotten dragons in order to believe its own pasts. Euron said, smiling with all his teeth. A city that keeps its heart behind 3 black walls because it is very old. A city with a tower that wishes to be taller than gods. We will take their height and lay it flat. But first we will make better shows in ports that have voices. Volantis has a bridge that thinks it is a street. Yunkai has tents on sand, where disease sleeps in bright cloth. We will make them sing and cough in the same breath. We will go to the place with bells. He turned and looked to the east as if men could look to the west by looking east long enough and with enough contempt. Below, a pair of boys had crept closer than their fathers would have allowed, and stood with their mouths open, as if afraid to breathe lest the dragon's breath be jealous. Rhaegal's head swung, and one boy wet himself without making a sound. The other put a hand out and touched the discarded curl of wood the claw had carved from Victorian's rail, as if taking a relic. They sailed at dusk, because dusk makes fires prettier. Astapor dwindled behind them into a red smudge, and then colorless bumps. The pale mare's breath blew from land upon their backs, and then lost heart and wandered. The sea took them as it always did, without favor, without boredom. On Marine's heights, Barristan and Selmy received reports that were not reports, but gossip told in careful tones. The Ironborn had gone. The Ironborn had taken brick. The Ironborn had taken coins beaten thin as breath and thick as wishbone. The Ironborn had set some of the corpses alight, by accident, and others, by accident, with a smile. He nodded as if these had been expected, because nothing is so stabilizing to men who bring bad news as a man who does not flinch. He sent the brazen beasts down among the sick to burn more corpses on purpose, and told them so in plain words. He startled 2 young unsullied by smiling at them. He allowed the green grace to waste the better part of an hour upon him with smooth phrases, and an account of how women had been forced to hear the screams of ships, as if ships were men. He said he was sorry for the women, and did not say what he thought of ships screaming. That night, as the first of the longships turned their bows like curious dogs toward Yunkai's shallows, Dany woke. She had not been asleep, not truly, but her eyes had been closed to give the men of the Khalasar around her less of a reason to stare. Drogon lifted his head because he felt the thing she felt, and because there are calls a dragon cannot pretend not to hear without losing something of himself. The grass spoke in its own small, dry language. The moon put one foot down upon the horizon and held it there, not committing to arrival. The horn spoke to them across the world like a remembered shame. It did not sound as men's horns sound. It came as a pressure to the soft places of the skull, as a heat at the back of the eyes, as a taste of smelted metal upon the tongue. It said a name, and then, the second time, it said it again. Drogon answered by screaming loud enough that 100 horses shied, and 2 men fell and cursed her, and then remembered their station and went still as their fear admitted rank. He beat the air with both wings and rose a little and came down because she had her hand fisted in the small of his neck and whispered nonsense in a voice that could not possibly carry over that sound, and did anyway. He snapped at the air twice more as if to catch the shape of the call and eat it, and found that air cannot be eaten in that way. He lowered his head and snorted a little smoke across her legs because he liked the way she smelled more when she smelled charred. Not yours, she said again, and believed it a little less. Quaithe had told her a dozen phrases that had sounded like a woman's way of not answering a question last year, and now one of them put its hand up. Kraken and dark flame. She had not liked the shape of that then. She did not like it now. The Kraken thinks all waters are its to use. The dark flame believes itself the only light. She pressed her lips to the hot leather of Drogon's neck, where scales softened, and felt him flex under her mouth with a muscle that ran from his breastbone to the base of his skull like a ship's hawser. We will go back, she told him. Not because she had decided it in this instant, but because the decision had been working, slow and careful, inside her for days, and now had found the right words. Drogon snorted again, less irritated now, more amused. He put his head down to nose at the grass, as if embarrassed for her, that she still needed words to say something that would be done when he did it. Yunkai from the sea looked like tents grown out of sand. It had walls. The walls mattered mostly to the men whose names were written on them. The walls had been built by hands that did not, and never would, own them. Flags moved with more ambition than the men below them. The wind carried out laughter and coughing, and the creak of leather, and the smell of men too numerous in a space too small for air to feel comfortable in its work. The horn called because Euron is a man who likes to begin a conversation with his voice. The dragons answered because they had learned the game. Euron did not order them to burn tents. That would have bored him. He had them blow flame in sheets low along the sand, so that heat moved like a living thing, and men learned how quickly a tent will give up being a house when asked by the right question. He had regal flame along the base of a great carved pole, with a god's face upon it, until the face ran, and men who had knelt before that face yesterday, and intended to kneel before it tomorrow, found they did not wish to watch its weeping and turned away. I know now. He had Viserion flash white along the line of horse pickets, until rope learned to be ash, and men learned the speed of hoof in close quarters. He asked for envoys with smiling flags, and envoys came with flags that shook in hands that had learned humility in hours. Victarion stood upon the iron victory, and discovered that there was a proper pride in being the instrument of terror. It sat heavy. It was like holding a hammer without striking. It is a weight that makes men feel their arms. He watched Sellsword's captains step out into sand with a set to their shoulders that said they disliked the day and wished to find a way to insult it for money. He saw one, a big man with a child's caprice in his eyes, raise a hand as if to wave and then decide that waving was servile and drop it again. He saw Brown Ben Plum and wondered at him because Brown Ben's face could have belonged to a man who had just eaten, and discovered the meat was not the meat he had ordered, but was palatable. "This is not a fight," Ben Plum told a Yunkish noble whose mustachios could have mopped a floor and whose stomach had decided to precede him as a herald. "This is a negotiation where you pay a fee to leave the room instead of to enter it." "The dragons will leave," the noble said angrily, "because anger is easier than shame." And he used the wrong word for will, because the Giscari tongue has more moods for verbs than a well-bred woman has fans. "They will go when told," Ben agreed cheerfully, "and that telling is expensive." He pinched his nose and then remembered he was meant to be at attention, and turned the pinch into an adjustment of a strap. He glanced once, quickly, toward the fleet and then away, and the glance was a man reading the weather. "I have learned," he muttered, not quite to himself, "to tell the difference between a dragon with a name in its ear and a dragon with a woman on its back. I do not like that difference." Victarion did not hear the words. He saw the shape of the glance and understood it. Euron stood with the horn as a king stands with a scepter, and did not blow it yet, because he liked the way the day moved when men knew he could. He told the Yunkish that he would take a levy of ships and men, and grain, and horses and girls, with bells in their hair. And he told them he would not take boys, because he did not want to import that particular disease, and would leave it here as a kindness. He smiled. The smile had courtesy to it. Men of Yunkai discovered in that moment that there are smiles the body recognizes as teeth uncovered. They paid because men under canvas who own other men for a living always pay poorer men to go away when poorer men arrive with fire. They paid in coin heavy with other men's names, and in silks that would have fluttered like festival had fire not taught them dancing yesterday. They paid in flesh, they called free, and in horses, they called ornaments. Euron stacked it all as if building a little city he meant later to kick aside. He loaded until the oars rode heavy, and men grunted under the weight of rope. And then he turned his face and pointed his prow west. Not because he had finished with the east. He would never finish with any place. Because his hunger, like a boy's, wanted to try a new sweet. He set his chin toward Volantis with the look a man gives a door he intends to put his shoulder neatly to. The dragons played above the line of ships in the last red of the day, their bellies learning the low light and liking it. At night, the sea wore black and little white. Mokoro's bowl burned on the quarterdeck with a flame that had lost its height in the wind and gained virtue in stubbornness. The dusky woman sat cross-legged near it, her hands in her lap, the scar upon her throat soft in the lamplight. Victarion's eyes were on the dark edge where water touches better dark. He spoke without turning. "I rode. You lived, she mouthed, and the shadow of a smile acknowledged both accidents. In my brother's hand, he said, and the words cost meat. For now, Mokoro said so mildly it was almost kindness. Doors open both ways. He will not give me the horn, Victarion said, and his jaw found an old grind and enjoyed it. He will wear it upon his pyre, Mokoro said, and his eyes gleamed with some inner draught. You will decide whether he is upon that pyre by accident or by plan. Euron Damfair, silent in his corner because gods do not need to be invited to their altars, watched the points of light the fleet made at sea as if they were stars some man had arranged improperly, and he were considering writing a letter to complain. He put his face down into a bucket of water and held it there until his body insisted, politely at first and then with urgency, that he lift it. He came up sputtering and shining, and smelled of honest brine. The sea will take him, he told the water, because the water listens. If the sea will not, I will help it remember its manners. On the third morning at sea, as Volantis uncurled in the far distance like a great cat, deciding at last to get up, Victarion opened the door in him again and did not close it quickly. He tasted something bitter and old and green. He tasted smoke that was not from ship nor tent, but from a fire that had been a god to men before men had been good at naming gods. He tasted wood sap and stone dust and oil, and found that his mouth had filled with water, although there was no piece of meat near. He closed the door only as far as to keep walking through the day. Volantis is not a city like other cities. It believes itself a continent. It stretches itself across the Rhône as if the river belonged to it and had always belonged to it, as if the river had not once belonged to a race of men whose ghosts still haunt reeds and shallows. The Long Bridge is not simply a bridge. It is a street laid across water. A bazaar and a town and a roof all at once, with houses and stalls jostling one another along its back, with beggars who have learned its different niches and which niches give better alms. The black walls are not simply walls. They are memory cast into stone blacker than night by fires men ought not to make. The old blood lie behind them and count their ancestry as other men count coins at night when anxiety eats sleep. The tiger of the city roars in the brick under the triarchs and believes his own voice cure for every ill. Euron saw it all with a lover's patience. He stood an hour motionless watching a single barge tilt under a load of melons, because it amused him that fruit should be so serious. He sent, not a herald, that would have been humility, but a note under a small flag with a crow's feather tied into its cord, and the note said only, "Blow your bells now, while you have them." He drank shade of the evening poured from a glass as delicate as lies, and licked his lower lip to catch the last drop, as if not wishing to waste any night upon it. He called the horn once, softly for himself, and no one else heard it, though every man on deck felt a prickle at the hairs close to the skin, at the base of the skull. He laughed. Small and genuine, because secrets are sweeter when you are sure they are good. Victarion did not laugh. He looked at the bridge and imagined fire. He looked at the black walls and imagined what it would take to heat stone that had forgotten how to be hot. He looked at the river and imagined choking it with men and with boats that underestimated what flame does upon water. He set his hand upon the rail, and the rail told him what it had always told him. That wood remembers every wave a ship has ridden and every hand that has comforted it. That men are outnumbered by wood. That wood in the end is kinder. The horn blew not to demand, but to announce. It made a small wrong note along the river, that only men with wrongness already in them heard, and Volantis pricked up its ears. The dragons came with less play this time. There was a hardness to the angle of their wings. Rhaegal's pupils were thin and bright. Visirion's nostrils smoked a little as if he were angry with himself for smoking. They circled over the long bridge, and the long bridge looked up with 1,000 eyes. Buying eyes, selling eyes, hungry eyes, eyes that had seen beyond their right number of days. They made a pass so close that the awning of a tea seller's stall burst into flame, and he batted at it with a cloth, and then decided that modest loss was affordable today, and let it burn, piling cups quickly into a safe box with a speed that made him think sadly of his own hands when they were young. A tide of screams moved along the bridge like thunder. The bells began at last. Volantis has bells for showing the city to itself. They hang in towers and upon arches. They speak the hours and the pride of houses and the news when news has been taught to put on a robe. When they all spoke at once, now it was like a sky made of metal. The dragons did not care for that sound. They banked away. They came around again. They were larger than the bells by a language hard to express. They roared because they wished their own metal to be heard and were satisfied by the result. The Triarchs sent a pair of swift galleys out upon the river with prows carved to look like beasts the old blood had told children stories about. They carried men in bright armor that wanted to believe in itself. Euron did not have silence meet them. He sent 2 smaller longships that did not have names famous enough to waste upon work. They slid in under the oar and spoke to the galleys with grapnels and with firepots. They set 1 galley aflame at the waterline so the river learned for a time to burn, and the men upon it jumped in with shocked faces and were pulled behind the stern of the longship and taught the ironborn alphabet in a hurry. The other galley swung its beak uselessly at the river and then found that the river had no use for such ornaments. It backed water as a lady backs a gown she has discovered makes her look ridiculous. The longships left off, scornful, not wasting temper where coin would do. "Ring them," Euron murmured, and Victarion did not know whether he meant the bells or the men. "Ring them until they have learned their own notes." He lifted the horn and held it, and did not blow. He glanced once, sideways, toward the black walls. It was a glance a man gives a high cliff he means to climb without rope, because he likes daring more than sense. "Later," he told the wall. "Later I will take a stone from you as a token." Mokoro's breath came warm at Victarion's ear. "When he tries that," the priest said, "heat will punish him on your behalf. The stone remembers the old fire. It does not forgive men who did not lay it." "He did not lay the horn," Victarion said, and Mokoro's teeth made a small show in his beard. "You see," he murmured, pleased to find his pupil noting first principles on his own. Negotiations took on the air of a great house hosting a plague. The old blood sent men who had voices trained to make other men's names feel small. They brought a little gold, insultingly little for their vaults, as an opening bid at buying delay. Euron took it and showed them, with a patient smile, how much more delay would cost. He did not speak long. He did not have to. The horn on the table made most of his sentences for him. Behind the men in their pale robes and their signet rings and their house colors moved the true city on the bridge, and the true city looked not at the horn, which it did not see, but at the dragons that drew lovely little shadows upon the faces of wives and thieves alike. Victarion thought of Old Town then, because his brother had put that thought in him like a nail, and because certain smells came downriver that did not belong to this water. He thought of the high tower rising like a green candle, and of maesters who had learned to sing to stones. He thought of septs. He thought of bells. He imagined for a disrespectful moment the 7 with their proper faces melting down their cheeks, as a dragon's breath taught them humility, and knew he had committed blasphemy against a god he did not serve and did not care. He touched the ring. He opened the door in him a hair. He tasted ash and fat and old water. He closed it. "West," Euron said at last that night, as a man says home when he means something else. "We will leave this river singing. We will let the bridge keep one tooth broken to remind it. We will take the wide sea. The mander waits like a throat gaping for a drink. The arbor will offer sweet, and we will burn its vines into a new vintage. Old Town will tall. The world will be right." He turned the horn idly in his hands and brushed a thumb across a rune as if smoothing hair. The horn's skin did not alter under that touch. It did not need to. It had learned a name, and it had learned a man. It was full now, like a bell with a new clapper. It liked its work. Victarion stood very still. He could feel the ring pain at his wrists pulse with his heart. He could feel Mokoro's gaze the way one feels a warm coal near the skin. He could feel Euron Damfair's prayer work along the planks like seawater finding an old seam in a hull. He could feel the dragon's breath on him still, as if the smell had entered his hair and would not leave until he put it into another wind. At dawn they would slip the river, nose to tide, and the city would be left with bells still telling itself it was large enough to have frightened dragons by the mere sound of its own importance. They would climb into the long swells, and the wind that has swept bricks clean of old pride for 1,000 years would meet them on its own terms. The horn would speak again, and the dragons would answer, and the sky would set itself to be red again. They would bend toward a coast green and gold and thick with fat men who had told themselves their ships were enough. Euron would laugh, and his laugh would be a small sound that traveled far. Men would die. Men would kneel. Men would decide to live, and live meaner than they had wished. Women would watch as God and gods argued in the air, and then went to the oven because bread must be baked whether the sky burns or not. On the long black roof of the Hightower, a man who had not slept well for weeks, and had, in compensation, taught 3 green glass things to glow without flame, lifted his head, though there was nothing to hear yet, and felt indigestion and blamed his cook. In the sept that believed itself a sanctum against every element, a boy priest dreamed he was drowning, and smiled in his sleep, because all water is baptism to boys. In Lannisport, a girl mended a net on a stoop, and looked up at a gull, half considering whether gulls could bring messages, and then laughed at herself because she was not a child. Beyond the Mander, the wheat stood foolishly straight, because it had never learned to kneel until too late. West, Euron said again, and the one blue eye shone like a star you might use to set your course, even if you did not like where it led. Rhaegal turned in the sky, indolent. Viserion rode a thermal above the bridge, and then tipped one wing in the way that meant he had been amused by something below. The horn lay ungainly and eager beneath Euron's hand. The sea waited with the patience of something that has already eaten everything it means to, and is content to wait for second helpings. Victarion went below and slept, and in his sleep he rode again without slipping. And the horn said Euron's name, and he did not spit at it, but he did not say it with his mouth, and he found the door and kept it open. In the dream a fire came at him, and he stepped into it, and out of it, as a man steps through a low wave, and is surprised to find himself only wet. In the dream he took the horn, and set it in a bucket, and poured brine over it without an arm to stop him. In the dream Euron laughed, and then the laugh turned into a sound like a bell rung in a drowned church. He woke before dawn. The planks spoke to him softly in their old tongue. The smell of oil and fish and sweat. The world still existed. He went up and the air was a little cooler, and Volantis' bells were silent, because even pride sleeps eventually. He set his hands on the rail. He did not pray. He did not know to whom in the air one prays. He waited for the oars to lift together and to go in, for the Ironborn to teach the river another of their verbs. He waited to feel the sea under him. He waited to see whether the dragon would look down at him with that slight question in its eye again, the one that had in it a child's impatience and something else that men have never learned to name. He waited to watch his brother be pleased with himself, and he waited to watch his brother's pleasure spoil. He waited to go west.